If you woke up in Tudor England, you didn't simply start your day. You stepped directly into a legal obstacle course you didn't sign up for, didn't fully understand, and definitely never agreed to. Tudor law wasn't something you encountered when you misbehaved. It was the wallpaper of life. A wallpaper made of parchment, inconsistent handwriting, and rules that could trip you faster than the uneven cobblestones. You didn't have to break the law. Existing near it was usually enough. For starters, Tudor laws governed everything. How much bread should weigh, what time the taverns must close, who could wear which fabrics, where you could stand during church services, and even how long you should grieve for your dead relatives before getting over it and marrying again. Law wasn't a separate category of life. It was woven into the fabric of society with all the softness of a coarse wool tunic. You breathed, ate, traded, walked, prayed, worked, travelled, and even sneezed under regulations drafted by people who would never meet you and never cared how complicated your day already was. Before we step into a world ruled by Tudor laws and harsh consequences, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing this story of everyday authority. Now, let's begin. Most people were peasants or labourers who spent their days producing food, hauling goods, or surviving weather that seemed personally offended by their existence. Yet despite this constant busyness, Tudor authorities never missed an opportunity to remind you. Even your most innocent actions had legal implications. Imagine dropping a loaf of bread. Today it's a clumsy moment. In Tudor times, someone might accuse you of trying to sell it illegally, evade weight standards, or tempt God with wastefulness. The law was like a supervisor that never clocked out. It just stood in the doorway, arms folded, daring you to improvise your way into trouble. Even the markets, the centre of everyday life as were miniature courts. Every transaction had rules. The width of cloth had to be measured to legal standards. Bread had to meet the mandated size. Ale had to follow brewing guidelines, and meat had to be slaughtered correctly or risk accusations of selling unwholesome flesh, which is Tudor for, this smells suspicious, therefore you're going to court. You didn't need a crime, you needed a cheese wheel that looked slightly too round. And it wasn't just goods. People were regulated too. Your clothing communicated your social rank, your work defined your legal duties, and your parish essentially acted as your tracking device. If you wandered too far from home for too long without a good reason, the world didn't see a traveller. It saw a potential criminal. There were laws to prevent you from pretending to be richer than you were, laws to stop you from dressing above your class, and laws to stop you from doing work that wasn't appropriate for your station. In Tudor society, ambition wasn't admirable, it was suspicious. The church was another legal theatre. Your religious attendance, behaviour during service, and compliance with royal religious changes were monitored with the enthusiasm of someone judging a neighbourhood singing competition. The law told you where to be, when to be there, how to behave, and how loudly to pray. Missing church wasn't just skipping, it was breaking the law. Oversleeping on Sunday? Illegal. Leaving early? Illegal. Sneezing at the wrong time? Technically not illegal, but don't tempt the wrong church warden. And don't forget local community duties. You might wake up one day to find you'd been assigned a position, constable, juryman, road overseer, or collector of fines, simply because your neighbours thought you looked responsible. Declining wasn't an option. In Tudor England, refusing a civic duty was itself illegal. Congratulations, you now enforce the same laws you barely understand. A flawless system. All of this created a society where the law wasn't a distant idea or an occasional threat. It was a constant companion. People didn't think, am I breaking the law? They lived in a state of, I hope nothing I do today accidentally counts as breaking the law. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. But perhaps the most exhausting part, the laws kept changing. Royal proclamations updated rules with the frequency of changing weather, often with the same level of predictability. You might go to sleep under one dietary regulation and wake up discovering you were supposed to have eaten fish yesterday. The law was not a stable institution. It was a very enthusiastic shapeshifter. In the end, Tudor life meant living inside a giant legal maze designed by people who thought confusion was a helpful motivational tool. The law wasn't just something that happened. It was something that hovered, quietly judging your attempts to simply stay alive, keep your family fed, and avoid public embarrassment. Welcome to Tudor England. You haven't broken any laws yet, but give it a moment. In Tudor England, the legal system had a single, undeniable centre of gravity, the monarch. The king wasn't above the law. He was the law. Parliament existed, judges existed, courts existed, but they all revolved around the king like planets around a fiery, unpredictable sun. If he spoke, the law changed. If he frowned, the law changed. If he woke up feeling philosophical, romantic, irritated, or slightly hungry, the law changed. It wasn't that laws shifted constantly, it was that they could shift instantly. Every Tudor subject lived with that tiny, anxious awareness in the back of their head. The monarch's mood swings had legal consequences. Today, you might be a loyal subject. Tomorrow, a legal inconvenience. The monarchy's absolute authority was rooted in the idea of the divine right of kings, the belief that God himself had personally picked the ruler and handed them the royal equivalent of a do not question badge. To disagree with the king wasn't just treason against the crown, it was basically disagreeing with God's hiring decisions, and that never went well. This power wasn't theoretical. It shaped every corner of governance. Parliament met only when the king requested it. Laws were drafted to reflect royal desires. Royal proclamations, written faster, passed faster, and enforced faster than formal laws, could reshape society overnight. If Parliament was the legal machinery, the monarch was the operator, the engineer, and occasionally the wrecking ball. Royal courts like the Star Chamber further cemented this authority. Unlike local courts, which tried cattle theft, brawls, and neighbourly disagreements about hedges, Star Chamber handled political cases, noble misconduct, and anything the king wanted to look very personally at the court didn't use juries. The king's advisers, speaking in his voice, made decisions with the calm certainty of people who knew nobody could appeal them. Justice wasn't blind. It had excellent vision and a very good memory. Under absolute monarchy, even loyalty had legal weight. Swearing an oath to the crown wasn't a ceremony, it was a binding law. Breaking it, intentionally or accidentally, was treason. In Tudor England, treason was less a crime, and more a flexible category the king could stretch like warm dough. Say the wrong thing? Treason. Associate with the wrong people? Treason. Fail to report suspicious behaviour? Also treason. The law didn't change often. The king's mood did. This instability was most famously visible under Henry VIII, a monarch who treated legislation with the same creativity he applied to marital solutions. He stretched the definition of treason so far that simply imagining the king's death, what lawyers generously labelled imagining the king, could get a person executed. Even silence could be dangerous. If you were quiet at the wrong moment, someone might interpret your face as rebellious. In the Tudor era, neutrality was not a survival strategy. It was a legal gamble. Successive Tudor monarchs wielded this legal dominance in their own styles. Edward VI, young and heavily influenced by Protestant advisers, signed proclamations that reshaped national religion with the ink strokes of a boy whose handwriting was still developing. Mary the Ray, devoutly Catholic, reversed policies, reinstated old ones, and burned Protestant dissenters with legal justification that rested entirely on her personal conviction that England's soul was at stake. Elizabeth I, brilliant and calculating, used royal authority more strategically. She didn't create chaos, she curated it. Laws became instruments not of emotion but of orchestration, a political symphony in which she held every baton. What all Tudor monarchs shared was this: the power to define legality by decree. Unlike modern systems with checks, balances, legislatures, and long debates, Tudor law could turn on a single command. This meant the legal status of actions, objects, and even ideas could hinge on royal preference. Something harmless today could be criminal tomorrow. Something criminal yesterday could be tolerated next week. The king or queen didn't merely influence the law, they breathed life into it and occasionally strangled it. This absolute authority had a psychological weight on everyday people. Even if you were a farmer far from the royal court, you felt the swirl of power. Your obligations shifted when the monarch shifted. Taxes changed. Religious duties changed. Court rituals changed. Even calendars changed. The monarch's will rippled outward, and you were expected to adjust with the grace of a dancer and the obedience of a statue. And here's the twist. Despite all this, Tudor subjects generally accepted the system. Why? Because it was normal. The king represented order, stability, divine protection, and the promise that at least someone understood what was happening, even if that someone had a terrible temper. The crown was both shield and sword. People didn't expect fairness, they expected hierarchy, but acceptance didn't erase fear. People learned to listen closely to court gossip, official proclamations, and anything that hinted at the king's mood. You weren't watching for laws, you were watching for signals. The monarch sneezed, might be a cold or a foreign policy shift. The monarch frowned, hope you didn't say anything unfortunate in public recently. In Tudor England, the legal system was not a structure made of rules. It was a living creature with a single beating heart in the royal palace, and as every Tudor learned early, if the king's heart fluttered, the law trembled. That was the nature of power, not logical, not consistent, just absolute. In Tudor England, most people lived under a legal system they couldn't read, couldn't reference, and couldn't hope to memorize. The majority of the population was illiterate, and even those who could read often didn't have access to actual written laws. Statutes weren't printed in handy leaflets, pinned to bulletin boards, or summarized on helpful posters like 10 rules to avoid death this week. Tudor law existed mostly as rumours, proclamations read aloud, and whatever your neighbour claimed he heard from a man who swore his cousin saw it written somewhere. This wasn't a flaw, it was the system. Tudor law was, for all practical purposes, an oral culture. Instead of reading laws, people heard them, and hearing them meant hearing someone's interpretation, not the text itself. You didn't know the law knew you. Laws were proclaimed aloud by sheriffs, parish officials, or appointed criers who roamed through towns, often on market days, shouting updates about new regulations with the dramatic flair of someone announcing a travelling circus. Their job wasn't to ensure understanding, only to ensure the sound entered your general vicinity. Whether you were too far away, too distracted, too deafened by livestock, or too hungover from questionable ale was not legally relevant. Once the crier shouted it, the law counted as known, even if you personally had no idea what was happening. Imagine it. You're buying onions at the market when someone rings a bell and yells, "By order of His Majesty," followed by words you can't fully hear because a goose is honking directly into your ear. Congratulations, you're now responsible for obeying whatever was said. If you later accidentally violate that law, you can't claim ignorance. But don't worry, everyone else misheard it too, so at least collective confusion is universal. Because reading was rare and books were expensive, the law became a strange blend of memory, gossip, and local reinterpretation. Court officials knew the laws, or at least pretended to, and common people learned pieces of legislation through second-hand storytelling. You might hear a law summarized by a neighbour whose understanding of the last proclamation was, "Don't do anything weird on Thursdays," and since nobody wanted to be the one to test its accuracy, everyone simply accepted it. This oral system also meant that law varied in quality of transmission. In one village, a proclamation might be recited clearly by a diligent parish clerk. In another, it might be mumbled by a man who mispronounced half the words and replaced the rest with creative guesses. And while you might think this inconsistency caused chaos, Tudor authorities considered it perfectly functional. From their perspective, the point of the law wasn't to be understood, the point was to be obeyed. This disconnect created a peculiar dynamic. People behaved legally, not because they knew what the law required, but because they feared stumbling into breaking it by accident. Obedience became a lifestyle, not a decision. Most people learned to follow the customs of their community because custom was safer than experimentation. If your neighbours didn't do something, you didn't do it either. The fastest way to become suspicious was to act unpredictably. In practice, the unwritten rules of daily life mattered more to common people than the official statutes. Villages had long-standing traditions about working hours, acceptable behaviour, church attendance, and economic interactions. These customs acted like local law guides, not written, not official, but widely trusted. If you followed them, you rarely got into trouble. If you didn't, even innocently, someone might accuse you of disrespecting tradition, subverting order, or harbouring suspicious new ideas. And Tudor society did not like suspicious new ideas. This informal system sometimes led to creative misunderstandings. A law might exist to regulate the price of wheat, but by the time it passed through 3 layers of oral explanation, your village interpreted it as "don't pick herbs after sunset." Confusing? Yes. Legally accurate? No. Socially enforced? Absolutely. Meanwhile, actual written laws were stored in places almost no one visited. Court archives, clerical registers, noble estates, or the minds of educated legal professionals. When people went to court, they weren't presented with a tidy summary of the law they had broken. Instead, they were told, often with great confidence and very little sympathy, that the law had always said what they were accused of violating. And since they couldn't read it to confirm, there wasn't much to argue. This illiteracy also meant contracts and oaths became heavily ritualized. You didn't read agreements. You repeated them aloud in front of witnesses, trusting that everyone present had remembered the wording correctly from their own past experiences. If someone forgot a clause, well, that was tomorrow's legal problem. All of this created an atmosphere where the law felt less like a written structure and more like a living rumour, hovering over society like a ghost, present, powerful, and rarely seen directly. The average Tudor subject didn't understand the law, but they understood the importance of appearing to understand the law. Pretending knowledge was a survival strategy. So daily life became an act of cautious conformity. People walked a narrow path of predictable behaviour, not because they loved rules, but because they feared the invisible ones. Knowing too little could get you punished. Knowing too much could get you accused of being clever. Another dangerous hobby in Tudor England. In the end, the law ran on fear, habit, and hearsay. You didn't need to read it. It already knew where you lived. In Tudor England, the law did not primarily arrive from royal palaces or distant courts filled with powdered officials. It arrived wearing muddy boots, carrying a staff, smelling faintly of livestock, and occasionally nursing a hangover. Local enforcement wasn't some polished institution. It was the deeply human, endlessly unpredictable world of constables, church wardens, and justices of the peace. These were the people who transformed law from theory into reality, and reality depended almost entirely on their personalities, temperaments, and whether breakfast had agreed with them. Justice varied by village and how well the ale sat that morning. Let's begin with the constable, the reluctant hero of local law enforcement. Serving as constable was not a career but a duty. You could be chosen because you owned a decent hat, or because the last man moved away, or because the parish decided you looked responsible, which usually meant you didn't start fights in church. Once selected, refusing the position was illegal. Congratulations, you now wield authority whether you want to, or not. Constables weren't trained, tested, or equipped. They learned on the job, usually by watching the previous constable and thinking, well, that seems close enough. Their responsibilities included arresting offenders, dragging people to court, supervising punishments, enforcing market regulations, breaking up tavern brawls, chasing vagrants, and making sure nobody did anything strange after sunset. The good constables tried their best to enforce the law. The bad ones enforced whatever they personally found irritating. And then there were the justices of the peace, JPs, arguably the most powerful local officials in Tudor society. These were wealthy landowners, gentlemen with estates, influence, and a confidence level that grew proportionally with their status. They handled everything from disputes to licensing to fines to serious criminal charges. A JP could decide whether your action was a minor slip or a moral catastrophe. Their judgments shaped communities. Their opinions shaped your fate. The legal system expected JPs to be stable anchors of authority. Human nature, however, had other plans. Because here's the truth. Tudor law was applied differently depending on where you lived and who was in charge. Some JPs were strict, harsh, and devoted to order. Others were lenient, distracted, or simply uninterested in chasing every infraction. Some had personal grudges, some had personal favourites, some genuinely cared for justice. Others cared more for lunch. You could walk 3 miles east and find a village where the JP believed drunkenness was a forgivable lapse. A gentle warning, maybe a small fine. Walk 3 miles west and enter a place where the JP believed drunkenness was the gateway to sin, crime, and possibly the collapse of civilization, and therefore deserved the stocks, a lecture, and the personal shame of being watched by judgmental chickens. This inconsistency created a landscape where justice itself was local culture. You learned the rules of your village not by reading statutes, most people couldn't, but by learning the peculiarities of the people enforcing them. Constables had their quirks too. One might insist on patrolling at dawn, waking everyone up by loudly clearing his throat outside their doors. Another might spend his night watch inside the tavern, because the criminals always passed by eventually. Another might take bribery as an insult, while yet another expected it as part of his annual income. Justice wasn't just personal, it was deeply emotional, and emotions mattered. A constable who slept badly enforced the law differently than one who slept well. A JP whose horse misbehaved that morning was less forgiving than one who enjoyed a peaceful ride. A constable with a headache was far more likely to arrest a loud neighbour. In Tudor England, fair treatment hinged less on legal consistency and more on the delicate chemistry of human mood. This wasn't necessarily malicious, it was simply how society functioned. The Tudor state relied on unpaid, part-time, occasionally competent locals to maintain order, because the crown didn't have the money or infrastructure to send professionals to every village. Delegation was a necessity. The unpredictability was an unintended side effect. And because these local officials lived among the people they governed, they often knew everyone's history, grudges, scandals, debts, romantic missteps, and embarrassing weaknesses. This meant legal decisions were never purely legal. They were social, personal, and sometimes embarrassingly petty. If you'd annoyed the constable last week by borrowing his tools without returning them, your accidental violation of a brewing regulation suddenly became a serious matter. If the JP enjoyed your singing voice in church, your disorderly behaviour in the tavern might be labelled spirited exuberance. Even reporting a crime depended on social dynamics. If you accused someone, disliked by the constable, your case would be pursued vigorously. If you accused your constable's brother's friend's cousin, well, prepare for disappointment. Justice could be swift, slow, or non-existent, depending on whose sheep grazed where and who had recently insulted whose garden fence. And then there was the problem of interpretation. Many laws were vague or broad, meaning local officials had generous room to improvise. A JP could decide whether your behaviour counted as a disturbance, a threat, or an innocent mistake. And if you dared argue, you weren't just arguing law, you were arguing with a man whose ego had legal authority. Despite all this, the system functioned because people adapted. They learned which behaviours were tolerated, which officials were strict, and which days of the week to avoid causing trouble. Communities developed unwritten guidelines, not based on statutes, but on personalities. Justice depended on proximity, relationships, and human nature. It was imperfect, inconsistent, and sometimes comically arbitrary. But it worked. Or at least, it worked enough for the Tudors. In a world where officials were judge, jury, and occasionally their own witnesses, the safest legal strategy was simple. Stay predictable, stay polite, and never anger a man whose breakfast had gone wrong. In Tudor England, justice didn't happen behind closed doors or inside quiet courtrooms with polished benches and solemn judges. No, justice was a community event, a performance, a show with a captive cast and an enthusiastic audience. Crime might have been the trigger, but the punishment was the real spectacle. Tudor society believed deeply in the power of embarrassment, humiliation, and collective gawking as moral instruction. Justice wasn't private. It needed an audience. For most common people, the law came to life during punishments, not trials. Trials were often quick, procedural, and predictable, but punishments were dramatic, public, affairs designed to be remembered, discussed, and feared. If you committed a crime, your real sentence wasn't the penalty itself. It was the experience of being watched while suffering it. The most common public punishments involved devices, uncomfortable, humiliating contraptions strategically placed in busy market squares where nobody could ignore you. The whole point was visibility. If the town square was the medieval version of social media, then the stocks and pillory were the Tudor equivalent of going viral for all the wrong reasons. The stocks held your feet, the pillory held your head and hands. Both held your dignity hostage. Locked into either device, you stood, or sat, or slumped, for hours, unable to protect yourself from whatever the public decided you deserved. Maybe they threw rotten vegetables, maybe they spit, maybe they laughed, jeered, or debated whether you looked guilty enough. In some places, the local children treated pillory sessions like festivals. You were not a person. You were content, and the community was encouraged to participate. The logic was simple. If enough people watched you suffer, everyone would remember not to commit the same offence. Shame wasn't an accidental result of punishment. It was the primary method. Tudor justice didn't care about rehabilitation. It wanted a lesson taught, loudly and collectively. Public punishments were scheduled strategically. Market days were ideal. Why punish someone in an empty square when you could wait until the entire county showed up with produce? The more people who saw you, the better. You were a living cautionary tale conveniently displayed where the ale sellers and cheesemongers could point at you and remind their apprentices, do your job properly or that's you. And if your offence involved dishonesty, cheating or moral failing, the humiliation was even more theatrical. A baker who sold underweight bread might be forced to wear a sign explaining his crime. A dishonest merchant could be made to stand beside the very goods he had overcharged for. A scold, someone charged with being too argumentative or disruptive, might be gagged with a metal bridle called the scold's bridle and paraded through town. Subtlety was not a Tudor strength. Some punishments even had costumes. You might be dressed in a ridiculous outfit to signal your crime, a visual shorthand so that even people who arrived late to the spectacle could understand why you were on display. Tudor justice loved labelling people, literally and metaphorically. Crowds treated these events as performances. People brought food, commented loudly, argued about whether the punishment was deserved, and sometimes offered unsolicited moral advice. A person in the pillory wasn't just paying for their crime. They were providing entertainment. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, though cruelty was definitely present. It was a believed necessity. The more dramatic the punishment, the more effective the deterrence, and the authorities encouraged this enthusiasm. Officials wanted the crowd to react. A silent audience meant the punishment wasn't working. The goal was to make every person watching think, whatever foolish decision led to this, I won't make it. Fear, embarrassment, and community participation were the holy trinity of Tudor deterrence. Some punishments were borderline ritualistic, Whippings, for example, were almost choreographed. The offender was tied to a post, the whip raised, and the lashes delivered slowly and rhythmically as spectators counted or commented. Whippings could take place in marketplaces, crossroads, or churchyards, places people naturally congregated. The punishment hurt, but the shame of being displayed hurt differently. And then there were cart rides. Offenders were tied to carts and pulled through town while crowds followed alongside. These parades transformed wrongdoing into an involuntary tour. You didn't simply confess your guilt. You rolled it through every street. Even lesser penalties had an audience, being ordered to stand at the church door for a Sunday service wearing a shameful garment. Count on every member of the parish stopping to stare. A forced apology delivered in a trembling voice before the congregation. The perfect Sunday entertainment. What's remarkable is how normalised this was. People didn't see public punishment as cruel. They saw it as necessary. A society without shame, they believed, was a society without boundaries. Public humiliation made rules visible. It converted law into something unforgettable. And for the person being punished, survival required endurance, patience, and a thick skin. Metaphorically, the actual skin was often left vulnerable. But what hurt most wasn't the pain or discomfort. It was the knowledge that people would retell the story of your punishment for years. Shame had a long memory. Yet for all its severity, public punishment wasn't personal. It wasn't about individual villainy. It was community theatre with legal consequences, a ritual that reassured people the world still made sense, because wrongdoers suffered visibly. In Tudor England, justice didn't hide in courtrooms. It stood in the street, invited the crowd, and made sure you learned the lesson, publicly. In Tudor England, property wasn't just property. It was a line drawn in stone, guarded by laws sharp enough to cut through any excuse you could offer. If you were hungry, desperate, poor, or simply unlucky, the law didn't ask why. It only asked what you took and who it belonged to. Survival was a personal problem. Theft was a legal one, and the legal one always won. Stealing bread might keep you alive for one day. The law disagreed. Tudor society operated on a frighteningly unforgiving equation. If you took something that wasn't yours, the consequences were vast, disproportionate, and often violent in a world with limited social safety nets, unstable harvests, and the constant threat of famine. Theft was seen not as a sign of poverty, but as a direct threat to community stability. When people were hungry, they didn't steal because they were villains. They stole because they were human. Unfortunately, Tudor law did not share that understanding. At the root of this harshness was fear, not of crime, but of chaos. The Tudor economy relied on fragile order. Farmers needed tools and animals. Merchants needed goods. Bakers needed grain. If people stole property whenever life became difficult, authorities worried the entire system would collapse. So instead of addressing poverty, they punished the symptoms, harshly. Property laws were brutally clear. Stealing even small items could result in whipping, branding, mutilation, or death, depending on the circumstances and the mood of the local justice system. If you stole goods worth more than a shilling, not exactly a fortune, you could legally be hanged. Think of all the things worth more than a shilling. A chicken, a pair of gloves, a loaf of bread large enough to support a family. In Tudor terms, this wasn't stealing. This was felony theft, and felony theft was a capital crime. And no, the courts didn't care that you hadn't eaten in 3 days. Bread was a particularly sensitive item. Grain shortages were a recurring nightmare, and bread riots could topple local stability. Because of this, bread was heavily regulated. Its price, weight, quality, and even the honesty of the baker were watched closely. Ironically, while bakers could face punishment for selling underweight loaves, a hungry labourer who stole one could face something far worse. The law viewed bread as community survival, not individual survival. So if you stole bread, the authorities didn't see a starving person making a last-ditch choice. They saw a threat to the town's ability to feed itself. You took food out of someone else's mouth, they argued, which meant you endangered everyone. The punishment had to be memorable so that no one else got the same idea. This mindset created a heart-wrenching contradiction. The poorer you were, the more likely you were to steal, but also the more harshly you were punished for it. A wealthy merchant caught embezzling might negotiate fines or favours. A hungry child caught stealing bread had no such options. Poverty became the perfect trap. You couldn't legally ask for help, but you couldn't legally take help either. And the consequences didn't end with the moment of punishment. Being branded as a thief, literally branded with a hot iron, could destroy your future. A branded hand told the world exactly who you were, no matter how many years had passed. Employers hesitated, neighbours whispered. Even finding a place to sleep became harder. The punishment followed you long after the crime. But not everyone who stole bread faced the same fate. Tudor. Justice had flexibility, if we can kindly call it that. A sympathetic constable might look the other way. A harsh justice of the peace might enforce the full penalty. A jury might undervalue the stolen item, deciding that the loaf was definitely worth less than a shilling, even if it wasn't, just to avoid sentencing someone innocent of real malice to a death penalty. Many juries became quite creative in this practice, effectively saving people from the gallows by pretending property was worthless. Still, this informal mercy wasn't guaranteed. Some regions enforced theft laws with ironclad rigidity. In others, local officials believed leniency caused more trouble than it solved. The same crime could earn a warning in one village and execution in another. Geography was fate. Parents warned children constantly. Never, ever, ever be tempted by something you didn't own. Hunger might torment your stomach, but the gallows ended the argument permanently. People learned to live with less, share scraps, stretch ingredients to absurd limits, and hope the harvest didn't fail. The law didn't care who you were, only what you touched. And yet, despite all of this, theft still happened. It had to. When winter bit too hard, when wages fell too low, when a family starved quietly in a cramped cottage, desperation always won. But the fear of punishment hung over every decision like a shadow. In the end, Tudor law treated property as sacred and survival as optional. Theft wasn't seen as a plea for help, it was seen as betrayal. And so the harshest punishments were reserved not for violent criminals or political rebels, but for the poorest, weakest, hungriest people in the kingdom. The bread may have kept you alive for the night, but under Tudor law, the consequences could take the rest. In Tudor England, the death penalty wasn't rare, shocking, or considered a last resort. It was, quite literally, part of the weekly schedule, a grim but ordinary feature of public life. Executions happened so frequently and so predictably that they blended into the background rhythm of the kingdom, like market days, church bells, or bad weather. You didn't gasp when you heard one was happening. You gasped if you somehow missed it. Execution wasn't shocking. Missing one was. To modern eyes, this seems unthinkable, but Tudor society maintained order through fear, certainty, and spectacle. The death penalty was the crown jewel of that system. It wasn't saved for monstrous crimes like murder or treason. Those were just the headliners. Dozens of lesser offences could earn you a noose, an axe, or a bonfire if you made the wrong enemy, the wrong choice, or the wrong impression. More than 200 crimes were technically capital offences, depending on the monarch and the decade. Theft of valuable goods, forgery, counterfeiting, arson, burglary, certain moral offences, and even repeated acts of vagrancy could result in execution. The legal system didn't view death as an extreme measure. It viewed death as a highly effective teaching tool. If a message needed to be sent, the gallows delivered it with excellent clarity. Because of this, execution wasn't a private matter handled discreetly somewhere official. It was always placed in the most visible locations: city gates, market squares, major crossroads, and designated execution grounds just outside town walls, places where traffic was heavy and gossip travelled even faster. People passing by didn't wonder what the scaffold was for. They wondered who would be using it today. The logistics were shockingly routine. Local officials scheduled executions like one might schedule roof repairs. You didn't want to put it off too long, or things might get messy. The gallows had to be maintained, ropes prepared, executioners available, crowds notified. The town crier might announce the event days before, just to boost attendance. After all, a poorly attended execution defeated the whole point. Crowds did not gather reluctantly. They arrived early. They brought snacks. They argued over vantage points. For many people, executions offered both entertainment and a moral lesson, a real-life demonstration of what happened to those who broke laws or displeased authority. Children were brought along too, because no Tudor parent wanted their offspring growing up uncertain about the consequences of bad behaviour. Some executions were small local affairs, a simple hanging for theft, performed quickly, efficiently, and with minimal theatrical flourish. Others were enormous public events, especially when the crime involved treason, counterfeit money, or offences committed by people of influence. These major executions were staged with careful planning, ceremonial steps, and an atmosphere that hovered between festival and funeral. Different crimes came with different methods. Hanging was the standard punishment for common criminals. Beheading, on the other hand, was reserved for nobility or for crimes involving political rebellion. It was considered a more honourable death, although one suspects most people tried not to dwell on the distinction too deeply. Burning was reserved for the gravest religious offences, especially during periods of intense religious conflict. These executions were intended not just to kill, but to make an unforgettable point. Executioners themselves were a unique class of professionals, feared, necessary, and often surprisingly well paid. They maintained tools, practiced techniques, and cultivated a sort of grim reputation. In some towns, the executioner doubled as a butcher or surgeon, which felt uncomfortably efficient but practical in a world that valued economy of labour. People knew them by sight, but tried not to speak to them unless absolutely necessary. A friendly executioner was unsettling, a cheerful one even more so. And yet, for all the machinery of death in Tudor England, the system wasn't mindlessly cruel. It was purposefully cruel. Every execution was designed to teach. Authorities believed that watching someone die for a crime would discourage countless others from committing similar acts. Whether this was true is debatable, but the belief persisted fiercely. Regular executions created something even stranger, a sense of emotional normalization. When death becomes common, fear becomes practical. People didn't collapse in terror at the sight of the gallows. They simply walked faster, said an extra prayer, or reminded their children not to get any ideas. People knew when executions were scheduled, and if they didn't, it didn't matter. Word travelled fast. You heard it from neighbours, friends, tavern keepers, or the local gossip network that never slept. And yet, despite the frequency, not everyone faced certain death when charged with a capital crime. Juries often used loopholes to downgrade offences. Officials sometimes stalled cases to allow mercy. Monarchs offered occasional pardons, but the system always leaned toward death, not away from it. The fact that mercy existed at all only underscored the brutality of the baseline. Still, the people adapted. They learned to keep their heads down. They learned which behaviour crossed invisible lines. They learned that life in Tudor England wasn't simply about following rules. It was about avoiding outcomes. And the worst outcome of all was delivered publicly, loudly, and with great enthusiasm from the crowd. The death penalty wasn't an extraordinary event. It was the grim punctuation mark at the end of Tudor justice. And if you went a full month without hearing about an execution, that wasn't peace. That was scheduling. In Tudor England, surviving your punishment didn't mean you were free. It meant you had just begun the second half of your sentence. The part you carried on your skin, your face, your hands, and your reputation for the rest of your life. punishments were designed not only to hurt in the moment, but to mark you permanently. You lived. The punishment stayed. Unlike fines or brief public humiliations, bodily penalties carried a different weight. They transformed you from an offender into a walking reminder of what the law could do. Tudor society believed firmly in the value of visible justice. If your crime didn't define you, then the punishment would. In a world where literacy was low and rumours spread faster than facts, the body became the legal document everyone could read. The most common of these lifelong punishments was branding. A hot iron, shaped into a letter or symbol, was pressed onto the offender's flesh, usually the thumb, hand, or in some cases the cheek. Each brand told a different story. A thief might receive a T, a vagabond might be marked with a V. The idea was simple. If someone committed a crime once, the authorities wanted to make sure the whole kingdom knew it if they tried again. A branded hand was more than scar tissue. It was a curse on employment, a warning to neighbours, a reason for strangers to distrust you on sight. When you reached for a loaf of bread in the market, people watched. When you tried to hire on as a labourer, your prospective employer checked your hands before your references. The brand told people who you were, even if you weren't that person anymore. And the branding process itself wasn't clinical. There was no sterile environment, no medical assistance, and certainly no anaesthetic. The iron was heated in plain view, often in the same square where public punishments occurred. The crowd watched the metal glow red. The smell of burning skin drifted through the air. The brand had to be applied firmly and cleanly. A weak impression could be seen as incompetence, and authorities didn't like incompetence in their punishments. Too faint a mark sometimes meant a second attempt. But branding wasn't the only lifelong sentence. Maiming was another, tool of Tudor justice, and it was used with a mix of practical purpose and theatrical emphasis. Cutting off ears, slitting nostrils, or amputating hands were all legally recognised penalties for a variety of crimes. It sounds barbaric, and it was, but the logic behind it was disturbingly straightforward. If your crime involved listening to forbidden rumours, cut off the ears that heard them. If your crime involved forging documents, remove the hand that forged them. If your crime involved public disorder or repeat offences, slit the nostrils as a permanent, unmistakable label. These punishments did not kill a person, which was, in the government's view, the entire point. A dead offender sent a message for a day. A mutilated offender sent a message for decades. Long after the crime had faded from memory, the mark remained, reminding everyone what happened to those who violated the law. Physical alteration was considered a deterrent more powerful than fear alone. Fear fades. Scars don't. A maimed person became part of the social landscape, a living caution sign. In villages where people knew each other from childhood, the sudden appearance of a branded hand or missing ear was a shock, a story, and a warning rolled into one. And the consequences of these punishments extended far beyond the physical. A damaged body became a damaged identity. Tudor communities valued reputation intensely. Honour was not just a moral virtue but a practical necessity. With a visible mark of crime, you were no longer a neutral member of society. You were someone who had crossed a line. People avoided trusting you. Families hesitated to associate with you. In some cases, marriage prospects evaporated entirely. After all, who wanted to marry someone who came with built-in legal baggage? Even simple tasks became complicated. Want to travel for work? Good luck explaining your brand to every constable you passed. Need to testify in court? Your maimed body could undermine your credibility. Seeking charity from the parish? Be prepared for suspicious looks and whispered doubts. The punishment reshaped your life in every direction. Some offenders tried to hide their marks. Gloves for the hand, scarves for the neck, hats pulled low. But concealment was risky. If a constable discovered you had attempted to cover up a legal brand, the concealment could itself be punished as deceit. And deceit, in Tudor logic, was proof that the original punishment hadn't taught you enough. The solution, more punishment. Because of all this, branding and maiming weren't just physical consequences. They were psychological sentences. They forced people into roles they never escaped. A thief branded once might spend the next 30 years trying to convince employers, neighbours and strangers that he wasn't still a thief. The brand stole opportunities long after it had scarred over. This permanence created a class of people who lived on the margins simply because society couldn't see past their skin. Many branded or maimed individuals drifted into itinerant labour, begging or petty crime, not because they wanted to, but because the legal mark had closed nearly every other door. The most tragic part: some of these marks were given for crimes committed not out of malice, but out of hunger, desperation, or misjudgment. The punishment made no distinction. A brand didn't ask why you stole, only whether you had stolen. In Tudor England, surviving your sentence didn't restore your place in society. It marked you permanently as someone who had fallen short. Your body carried the story, long after the law moved on. In Tudor England, if you wanted to see the local news, neighbourly drama, community gossip and moral lessons all in one place, you didn't open a newspaper, you visited the stocks. The wooden frame with holes for legs or wrists was more than a punishment device. It was the community message board, the forum, the feed, the trending topic, and the comment section rolled into one. You didn't go viral, you went wooden. The stocks were placed in the most inconveniently convenient spot, right where everyone had to pass. Market squares, crossroads, churchyards, anywhere the daily flow of humanity was loudest and least avoidable. The whole point was visibility. A person locked into the stocks was impossible to ignore. They sat, immobilized, elevated or grounded depending on the design, surrounded by familiar faces who were suddenly encouraged, legally and morally, as to judge them. The device itself was simple: a solid timber frame with 2 or 3 holes, usually for the ankles, sometimes for the wrists, occasionally both. Once locked inside, you couldn't scratch, shift, hide, or maintain dignity in any form. Your legs went numb, your back ached, your pride evaporated. The stocks didn't need to injure you physically. They were designed to injure you socially. People often imagine these punishments as moments of intense pain, but the true torture was the waiting. Hours of stillness, exposed to weather, conversation, and the unpredictable creativity of bored villagers. Tudor law embraced humiliation as a tool. The shame was the sentence. Everything else was bonus material, and the public took their role seriously. When someone landed in the stocks, crowds gathered the way people gather around a street musician or a suspiciously dramatic argument. Villagers approached as though inspecting a carnival attraction. What did he do? I heard he insulted the church warden. No, I heard he sold ale on a fast day. My cousin's neighbour said he used the Lord's field without permission. The truth didn't matter half as much as the story. The stocks ran on rumour-powered engagement. If someone didn't know why you were there, they'd ask loudly, ensuring you had to explain your humiliation to strangers again and again. It was the Tudor equivalent of having your worst mistake pinned to the top of your profile for everyone to comment on, except the comments were shouted directly into your face, and those comments could escalate. Villagers threw things, vegetables, mud, insults, whatever they had on hand. Children delighted in poking, tapping, or giggling at you. Drunks felt obligated to give long lectures about morality. Friends pretended not to recognize you. Enemies didn't have to pretend at all. Even the weather criticized you. Rain soaked you. Sun burned you. Wind chilled you. Everything participated in your punishment. Nature was an enthusiastic co-conspirator. But the stocks weren't just entertainment. They were community enforcement. This was justice performed by the public, with the public, for the public. The message was clear. If you violated the norms, the community would correct you. Not behind closed doors, but through collective judgment. A wrongdoer wasn't merely punished. They were displayed like a cautionary banner in a Society where literacy was limited, the stocks communicated in the clearest language possible. Visual humiliation. A person in the stocks told a story without needing any text. People understood instantly. Crime leads to consequences you can't outrun. Fear kept most people in line, but it was fear shaped by social exposure, not legal theory. And because the punishment was public, reaction varied wildly based on the offender's personality and reputation. A beloved villager might receive sympathetic glances, minimal harassment or supportive gossip like, "He's always been a good man. This must be a misunderstanding." A disliked villager received the opposite, gleeful jeering, exaggerated storytelling, and enough thrown objects to qualify as agricultural recycling. But the stocks did something else too, something surprisingly effective. They created memories. Every bystander, from children to grandparents, witnessed the punishment. Years later, people still recalled who had been locked in the stocks and why. It didn't fade. It became part of the communal archive. This meant the punishment didn't last a few hours. It lived on in reputation. You might be released at dusk, stretch your aching legs and scrape the mud off your tunic. But the story followed you home, to church, to work, to every tavern conversation. You didn't merely pay your dues, you starred in a performance that nobody forgot. And unlike branding or mutilation, the stocks didn't alter your body, they altered your social standing. For some people, this was worse. A missing ear might be explained with a good lie or a tragic story. But time in the stocks, everyone knew exactly what it meant. There was no hiding it, no covering it, no rewriting it. Yet for all its humiliation, the stocks were still considered merciful compared to harsher punishments. You survived them intact, physically anyway. You returned home. You continued working. Life went on. But the stocks left a mark, where everyone could see it. Not on your skin, on your identity. And perhaps this was the most Tudor thing of all. The belief that shame could shape society more efficiently than violence. Punish the behaviour openly. Let the consequences linger invisibly. Allow the community to enforce the law long after the wooden frame is empty. You didn't go viral. You didn't trend. You didn't get likes or shares. In Tudor England, you simply got locked in place, and the world came to see. In Tudor England, the law didn't simply disadvantage women, it shrunk them. Not physically, of course, but legally. A woman could be tall, clever, hard-working, or admired. But the moment she stepped into the world of Tudor law, she became smaller, less capable, less independent, less visible. You had rights. They belonged to someone else. At the core of Tudor gender law was a principle inherited from medieval England and reinforced through centuries of tradition: coverture. Under this doctrine, married woman's legal identity merged with her husband's. Merged is the polite word. The harsher, more accurate word is absorbed. She ceased to exist as a separate legal person. She couldn't sue or be sued. She couldn't make contracts. She couldn't independently own property. She couldn't even keep her own wages. Anything she earned, inherited, or possessed effectively passed into her husband's hands like an automatic tax. Marriage, in the legal sense, was a transfer, not just of affection or household roles, but of identity. Unmarried women, known as femmes sole, had more legal autonomy. They could own land, run businesses, sign contracts, and defend their rights in court. But the moment they married, these powers vanished into the legal vapour. The transformation was instantaneous. One day you were a full legal person, the next you were a dependent with fewer rights than many teenage apprentices. And it wasn't merely property. Authority itself was defined through male guardianship. Fathers, brothers, uncles or husbands acted as the legal representatives of women, whether the women wanted representation or not. If a woman wished to make a decision involving land, money or long-term commitments, the question was never what do you want, but which man is signing for you. This dependency permeated every aspect of law. If a woman was assaulted or wronged, The case often belonged to the male head of household, who sued on her behalf. The injury was interpreted partly as an injury to him, his household, his honour, his property. In extreme cases, harm done to a woman was legally calculated based on her value to the man responsible for her. Essentially, the law protected women only by protecting the economic interests of the men who claimed them, and when a woman committed a crime, the legal consequences also passed through the male figure representing her. If she stole something, the assumption was that her husband should have controlled her behaviour. If she caused a disruption, her husband might be blamed for failing to manage his household. This wasn't protection. It was guardianship mixed with surveillance. But the legal dependency didn't end with adulthood. Girls were under strict authority from birth. Their marriages could be arranged, often with a little input from them, because marriage was as much a financial strategy as a personal union. A daughter's hand could be a bargaining chip for alliances, business deals, or social advancement. Consent existed, but in practice it functioned more like polite acknowledgement than meaningful choice. When it came to work, Tudor women were indispensable, on farms, in households, in markets, at looms with livestock. Yet the law rarely acknowledged their contributions. Women who worked earned wages that legally transferred to their husbands. Widows were often respected business owners, but even they had limitations. They held property for the duration of widowhood, a legal way of saying, this is temporary, don't get comfortable. And if a widow remarried, her new husband gained immediate control of everything she possessed, including goods she had inherited from her previous husband. The law didn't say, welcome back to marriage, enjoy your partnership. It said, new husband, please take your complementary rights over everything she owns. Women did appear in court as witnesses and plaintiffs, but their testimony carried less weight than men's. They weren't mindless or incompetent, far from it, but the law distrusted their judgment, believing women were more emotional, less rational, and too easily influenced. This wasn't based on evidence. It was based on tradition, assumption, and the unshakable confidence of men who had never let women speak long enough to prove them wrong. Tudor society also enforced moral regulation far more harshly on women than on men. Sexual misconduct, pregnancy outside, marriage, or even suspicious behaviour could land a woman in trouble. She might be punished, shamed, or paraded as an example of fallen virtue. Meanwhile, men rarely faced equivalent consequences. A man could recover from scandal, a woman carried it for life. But the law wasn't purely punitive. It also structured women's roles in predictable ways. A married woman managed the household, and household in Tudor England meant the economic engine of survival. She brewed ale, baked bread, raised children, managed servants, balanced household accounts, and often contributed directly to the family business. In reality, she was indispensable. In law, she was invisible. This invisibility extended to inheritance too. Sons inherited land. Daughters inherited what sons didn't want. A husband could control his wife's dowry, but she couldn't reclaim it without legal battles. And even widows entitled to a third of their husband's estate, their dower, often had to fight, tooth and nail for it. Women lived full, complex, essential lives, but the law flattened them into shadows of the men around them. Yet despite this legal diminishment, Tudor women navigated the system with remarkable skill. They manipulated customs, used social networks, appealed to sympathetic officials, and carved out influence in places where the law refused to acknowledge they had any. A clever woman could wield considerable power, informally, indirectly, and quietly. But the law never reflected that reality. On parchment, in court, in contracts, and in legal definitions, women remained legally minimized, constrained by structures built to prioritize male authority. You had rights of a sort. But the law made sure they fit neatly into someone else's hands. In Tudor England, marriage wasn't a romantic milestone or a sentimental promise two people whispered under candlelight. It was a binding legal contract, negotiated, witnessed, enforceable, and often far more permanent than the actual affection holding the couple together. A marriage didn't simply unite two people. It fused their property, their obligations, their identities, and their futures into a web of consequences that neither partner could easily undo. Love was optional. Contracts were forever. To understand Tudor marriage, you must first abandon the modern idea that a wedding is primarily an emotional agreement. In the Tudor world, marriage existed in the realm of law, economy, family strategy, and social expectation. It wasn't two hearts intertwining. It was two households signing a merger, and this merger began before the ceremony. The process started with negotiations, not between lovers, but between families. Dowries, jointures, property rights, and future inheritance were discussed in detailed terms that sometimes resembled business deals more than courtship. Who brings what? Who controls what? Who gets what upon death? These were the questions that shaped marriages. The woman's family contributed a dowry, money, goods, or land transferred to the groom as compensation for taking on the financial burden of a wife. In return, the husband's family provided a jointure or a dower guarantee, ensuring that if the husband died first, the widow wouldn't be left destitute. All of this happened before the couple exchanged a single vow. Consent did matter legally, but it existed in a world where social pressure, family expectation, and economic necessity shaped what choice actually meant. A marriage declared without consent could be challenged, but refusing a match chosen by your family required boldness most Tudor youths didn't possess. Many couples married not because they disliked each other, but because they were barely consulted. And the ceremony itself? That was the moment the legal world kicked into full force. Once vows were spoken publicly, ideally in church, though technically a mutual declaration before witnesses was enough, the law recognised a new household, a new economic unit, a new legal structure. From that moment on, a married woman's legal existence merged with her husband's under coverture. She couldn't sign contracts independently, own her own property, file lawsuits, or manage money without her husband's permission. Her wages were his wages. Her possessions were his possessions. Even personal gifts given to her often transferred legally into his ownership. The law's assumption was simple. The husband acted for them both. For men, marriage expanded legal power. For women, it erased it. And the law didn't only regulate property, it regulated behaviour. Husbands gained legal authority to discipline their wives physically within reason. What counted as reasonable depended on the community, the man, and the willingness of others to intervene. Marriage provided men with a legitimised claim to their wives' obedience. If a woman acted against her husband's wishes, she could be punished informally at home or formally in court for disrupting household order. For wives, separation from a husband was nearly impossible. Divorce, as we understand it, did not exist. Annulments could be granted, but only when the marriage could be legally proven invalid from the start, such as cases involving pre-existing marriages, consanguinity, or impotence. And yes, proving that last one in public was as embarrassing as you imagine. Most unhappy couples simply lived unhappily, separated in practice but not in law. This permanence made marriage a high-stakes decision. Once bound, you stayed bound. The law assumed duty, not happiness, was the foundation of a household. But marriage also brought obligations beyond the couple themselves. Husbands were legally responsible for their wives' actions. If a wife committed a civil wrong or minor crime, the husband often paid the fine. If she accumulated debts, they became his. Marriage fused accountability just as thoroughly as it fused property. For wives, the consequences could be harsher. If a married woman engaged in wrongdoing, the law often assumed the husband failed to maintain control. Her behaviour reflected on him, and not in flattering ways. The law saw the household as a miniature kingdom, and the husband was expected to rule it firmly. Despite all this control, wives were crucial economic partners. They managed the household, an operation involving food production, textile work, the hiring of labourers or servants, and daily financial management. If the family ran a shop, inn, alehouse, or farm, the wife often handled major responsibilities. Yet the law recognised none of it. She worked at every level of the household economy while the legal system pretended she was merely assisting. Marriage shaped inheritance too. When a man died, his widow had rights, but limited ones. She was usually entitled to a third of his land for the duration of her life. The rest went to sons or nearest male, relatives. If she remarried, her new husband gained control of her property and any dower she had previously held. Widowhood, in legal terms, was a brief window of independence, one that closed swiftly upon remarriage. Marriage also regulated sexuality. Adultery was a serious offence for women, not just morally but legally. A wife's infidelity threatened inheritance lines and property transmission. For men, adultery was considered improper, but rarely catastrophic. The law's double standard was so embedded that it didn't even feel contradictory to the people living under it. But marriage was not uniformly bleak. Many Tudor couples lived cooperatively, affectionately, even joyfully. They worked together, raised families, built livelihoods, and shared burdens. Yet the legal structure beneath their lives remained rigid, unequal, and unforgiving. Because in Tudor England, marriage wasn't a love story. It was a contract with witnesses, a contract you couldn't renegotiate once signed. Love might make the days easier, but law made the years permanent. Childhood in Tudor England was not the protected, cushioned, exploratory phase people imagine today. It was shorter, harsher, and legally far more dangerous. The law didn't draw a comforting boundary around the young. Instead, it treated children less like developing humans and more like small adults in training who were expected to know better long before they physically could. Too young to read, old enough to hang. The first shock to modern senses is the age of criminal responsibility. 7. 7 years old, the age when modern children struggle to tie shoes or remember where they put their toys, was, in Tudor law, the age at which you could be held fully accountable for your actions. If you caused harm, committed theft, or misbehaved in ways the community considered intolerable, you were judged by essentially the same standards as adults. Of course, the legal system claimed to consider a child's understanding of right and wrong. In practice, however, it often relied on assumptions. If a child was strong enough to lift something, clever enough to hide something, or bold enough to run from something, then clearly they understood guilt. And if they understood guilt, they understood crime. And if they understood crime, well, the next steps followed the grim logic of Tudor justice. This meant young children could face harsh punishments, whipping, time in the stocks, detention in local jails, and in some extreme cases even execution. Yes, execution. While rare, cases exist of children under 12 being hanged for thefts or violent acts. The law insisted that acts demonstrating malice showed moral understanding, which meant the child could be punished as an adult. Childhood was not a legal shield. It was a thinner cloak that tore easily. But criminal law wasn't the only place children faced intense scrutiny. The entire structure of Tudor society relied on children becoming useful as early as possible. Idleness was condemned not just morally, but legally. Children without work were considered at risk of becoming vagrants, a crime that carried terrifying penalties. So children were pushed into labour early. Boys learned trades, farming skills, or apprenticeships. Girls learned housework, textile production, brewing, childcare, and the endless tasks that kept households functioning. From the moment a child could walk steadily and understand instructions, they were expected to contribute. Helping churn butter, legal. Helping herd geese, legal. Being found wandering about without purpose, suspicious. Work ethic wasn't merely encouraged, it was enforced. Parents carried legal responsibility too. A child's misbehaviour reflected the household. If a child stole a small item, people didn't just blame the child, they questioned the moral discipline of the parents. Households were expected to regulate, supervise, and correct their children before the law had to. Failing to do so brought shame and sometimes legal repercussions. Schooling existed but varied greatly. Grammar schools trained boys, rarely girls, in Latin, reading and scripture, but most children received no formal education at all. Illiteracy didn't excuse them from responsibility. The law assumed a child could understand commands, even if they couldn't read laws. So a child might not read a single word in their life, yet still be punished for violating statutes they had never seen. The second major legal realm shaping children's lives was labour contracts, especially apprenticeships. Apprenticeships were binding agreements, often lasting 7 years or more, designed to train young people into trades. Once signed, usually by adults on the child's behalf, these contracts were difficult to break. Apprentices who ran away faced legal consequences. Masters who mistreated apprentices might be reprimanded, but the burden of obedience still fell heavily on the child. Failing to honour an apprenticeship wasn't just a personal mistake, it was a breach of legal duty. Then there was the issue of orphanhood, a terrifying legal status. An orphan didn't inherit independence, they inherited vulnerability. Parish officials could place orphan children into service, assign them to households, or indenture them. The law believed it was protecting children from vagrancy, but in reality it created a pipeline where the poorest, most helpless children became cheap labour for families who needed free hands more than extra mouths. The church also held authority over children's lives. Moral offences, disobedience, stubbornness, and inappropriate behaviour could bring children before ecclesiastical courts. Scolding, penance, or public shaming awaited those judged unruly. The church saw itself as shaping young souls, and the law supported this mission wholeheartedly. A difficult child could become a moral lesson for the whole parish. But perhaps the most defining feature of childhood under Tudor law was how much was expected from so little. Children were treated as responsible long before they had the emotional or cognitive development to navigate danger. Their world was filled with pitfalls, picking the wrong berries, touching the wrong item at market, speaking rudely to an elder, wandering into the wrong field, breaking Sabbath expectations, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to legal trouble. Because childhood wasn't seen as innocence, it was seen as preparation. A child was a future worker, a future servant, a future apprentice, a future spouse, and eventually a future subject of the crown. The law didn't shield children, it trained them. Yet amid this harsh structure, children were still children. They played games, invented mischief, formed friendships, and created laughter in the cracks of a rigid world. But even those moments were shaped by fear of stepping across legal lines they didn't fully understand. Childhood in Tudor England wasn't measured in years. It was measured in responsibilities and consequences. Too young to read, too young to write, too young to understand the laws stacked against them. But old enough, according to Tudor justice, to answer for every mistake. In Tudor England, poverty wasn't understood as misfortune, inequality, or the natural result of unstable wages and unpredictable harvests. Poverty was treated as a personal failure, something suspicious, something shameful, something that needed to be punished rather than relieved. The poor didn't simply struggle under the system. You didn't fail the system. You offended it. To understand Tudor poverty laws, you must imagine a world where nearly everyone lived near the edge of survival, yet the law distinguished sharply between the deserving and undeserving poor. These weren't categories of compassion. They were legal classifications, and being placed in the wrong one could determine whether you received help, punishment, or outright violence. The deserving poor were those whom society believed had no choice: the elderly, the sick, the disabled, widows and orphaned children. These individuals could receive limited parish assistance, usually in the form of bread, small coins, or the right to beg within a designated area. The law didn't exactly embrace them, it tolerated them. But the undeserving poor, those were the people the law targeted with ferocity. This category included anyone physically capable of work who wasn't currently employed, anyone travelling without clear purpose, anyone begging outside designated zones, anyone sleeping outdoors, and anyone whose appearance suggested instability or desperation. In other words, if you were poor and visible, you were a problem. The Tudor state associated mobility with danger. People who wandered, vagrants, sturdy. Beggars, masterless men and idle women, represented a threat to social order. They weren't tethered to a household, a master, a trade, or a parish. And Tudor England saw this untethered existence as a kind of rebellion. If the community didn't control you, who did? The fear wasn't abstract. Economic instability created waves of homelessness. Failed harvests, seasonal unemployment, and sudden illness pushed people onto the roads. But instead of addressing these causes, the law criminalised the symptoms. A hungry man walking to another town in search of work wasn't seen as trying to survive. He was seen as breaking the law. The Vagrancy Act hammered this point home. Henry VIII's laws targeted wanderers aggressively, and later Tudor monarchs only expanded this hostility. Punishments varied depending on the decade, but they were always severe. A first-time offender could be whipped until their skin broke. A second offence could bring imprisonment or branding. A third offence? Execution was not off the table. Punishment wasn't meant to correct behaviour. It was meant to terrorise others into staying put. Whipping was particularly common. A vagrant might be stripped to the waist, tied to a post, and lashed publicly in the marketplace, the same place where they might have begged for food earlier. The logic was chillingly consistent. If hunger forced you onto the road, pain would force you off it. Branding reinforced the lesson. A V for vagrant might be burned into your chest or forehead, marking you permanently as someone the law despised. Even if you found work later, your branded skin told employers that you were unreliable, undesirable, and legally tainted. Poverty had become a criminal record you couldn't erase. And yet, one of the cruelest aspects of Tudor poverty law was how profoundly local it was. Every parish had a duty to support its own poor, but only its own. If you wandered into a new parish seeking work or shelter, officials could forcibly remove you, escort you to the boundary, and expel you back to where you belonged, even if you had no home left there. The message was clear: your survival is not our problem. This created a nightmarish cycle. Lose work, become homeless, forced to wander, arrested for wandering, whipped, released back into homelessness, punished again. The law didn't help the poor survive. It ensured they suffered. Women faced additional danger. A woman travelling alone risked being labelled a prostitute, whether or not she had ever engaged in sex work. If she was poor and unmarried, the assumption was automatic. Authorities believed idleness bred immorality, and they treated wandering women as both criminal and corruptive. The law also conflated poverty with dishonesty. Beggars were assumed to be liars unless proven otherwise. Some Tudor statutes specifically targeted counterfeit crankies, people whom lawmakers believed pretended to be disabled or ill in order to beg more effectively. The state viewed desperation through a lens of suspicion, not empathy. And yet Tudor society relied on the very people it punished. Poor labourers harvested crops, tended livestock, built roads, cleaned homes, and performed the unending tasks that kept the country functioning. Without the poor, the Tudor economy would have collapsed, but the law insisted on keeping them firmly controlled, monitored, and, if necessary, punished into submission. Despite this oppressive system, many poor people developed strategies of survival. They formed informal networks, relied on seasonal migrations, bartered services, or took on multiple precarious jobs. Some sought temporary refuge in monasteries until Henry VIII demolished them. Others navigated the dangerous tightrope of begging discreetly enough to avoid arrest, while visible enough to attract charity. But the truth remained. The poorest Tudors lived in a legal minefield where any misstep, any movement, any appearance, any attempt to survive could be interpreted as criminal behaviour. Being poor wasn't a social issue, it was a legal violation. You didn't fail the system, you offended it, simply by needing help to live. In Tudor England, work wasn't just a way to survive, it was a legal requirement. You didn't get to choose whether you wanted a job. The law decided that for you. Whether work was available, reasonable, or remotely possible didn't matter. In the eyes of the Tudor state, every person had a duty to be employed at all times, in all seasons, under all circumstances. You needed a job. The job didn't need to be real. This idea took shape through a series of labour acts meant to control wages, regulate mobility, and force people into predictable social roles. Tudor lawmakers were terrified of idleness, not because it was lazy, but because they believed it led directly to disorder. An idle person was a person capable of wandering, rebelling, begging, questioning authority, or, worst of all, thinking independently. A hard-working population was easier to control. The largest weapon in this battle against idleness was the Statute of Artificers, 1563, an enormous piece of legislation that attempted to regulate the entire labour force of England. It dictated who could work, where they could work, how long they could work, and how much they could legally be paid. You couldn't simply decide to switch trades or move towns. Employment wasn't freedom, it was containment. Under this law, every able-bodied person between the ages of 12 and 60 was required to be employed. If someone wasn't working, officials didn't ask why work wasn't available. They asked why you weren't already doing it. The problem wasn't unemployment. The problem was you. The law assumed that work always existed somewhere, which was wildly optimistic in a world of seasonal harvests, variable wages, unstable markets, and communities that could barely sustain themselves. Tudor lawmakers, most of whom were wealthy landowners, imagined the labour market as a field full of waiting opportunities. In reality, jobs were scarce, wages were low, and many communities couldn't absorb all their workers. But the law's solution to this gap was simple. If the job you needed didn't exist, you were expected to pretend it did. Officials could order unemployed people into service. A constable might appear at your door and assign you to work for a local master. It didn't matter if the master needed you, liked you, or even knew you existed. If the order was made, the employer had to accept you, and you had to obey. If you refused employment, you weren't labelled independent or self-directed. You were labelled a criminal. In many cases, people were forced into compulsory service, especially young people. A child as young as 12 could be seized by parish officials and placed into an apprenticeship or labour contract, regardless of personal preference. Choosing a career path was a luxury for the elite. For everyone else, the law did the choosing, and once chosen, that path locked you in for years. Apprenticeships, which ideally were meant to teach valuable skills, often became a form of legal captivity. An apprentice could not break their contract without the master's permission, even if the master was abusive or incompetent. Running away wasn't just a personal decision, it was a punishable offence. Meanwhile, adult workers were regulated with equal precision. Labourers could not negotiate wages freely. The government set maximum rates to prevent workers from demanding more during times of scarcity. This system ensured that employers maintained control, while workers remained perpetually dependent on the goodwill, or lack thereof, of those above them. And during harvest seasons, the law tightened its grip even more. Anyone capable of physical labour could be forced into the fields, whether or not they wanted to work in agriculture. Urban artisans, apprentices, servants, widows, and even scholars could be conscripted to rural labour if officials decided the harvest needed extra hands. Refusal was illegal. This wasn't economics. This was discipline disguised as economics. Tudor authorities believed that an employed population was a peaceful population. People who worked long hours in demanding jobs had less time or energy to rebel, question, or wander. The goal wasn't prosperity. It was predictability. And so the state treated work as a moral duty. To be idle was to be dangerous. To be unemployed was to be suspicious. To travel in search of work was to risk being arrested as a vagrant. To wait patiently for work to appear was to invite legal trouble. You had to be employed, even if employment was invented for you, even if wages were laughable, even if the work was exploitative. This obsession with controlling labour seeped into daily life. Parish. Officials monitored households closely, checking who worked and who didn't. Masters of apprentices were required to report misbehaviour. Courts punished people for refusing honest labour, a phrase vague enough to justify almost any accusation. Even beggars who were legally allowed to ask for charity were expected to work if physically able. The logic was relentless. If work existed, you had to take it. If work didn't exist, you had to find it. If neither existed, the law invented something for you to do and punished you if you failed. All of this created a tense, rigid society where people walked a legal tightrope every day. They worked not because they were paid well, treated fairly or respected as contributors, but because the law said they must. Their labour wasn't valued. Their obedience was. Work, in Tudor England, was not opportunity. It was obligation, a compulsory performance of usefulness in a system that cared less about people's survival than about their compliance. You needed a job, even when the only thing guaranteed was the punishment for not having one. In Tudor England, religion didn't live in your heart. It lived in the law. It wasn't a private comfort or a personal philosophy. It was a system of requirements, obligations, and surveillance so deeply woven into daily life that your spiritual choices became legal decisions. Faith wasn't something you quietly believed. It was something you publicly performed, and if you performed it incorrectly, the consequences were not philosophical debates. They were punishments. Believe correctly. Incorrect belief had penalties. The reason for this was simple. Tudor monarchs believed that religious unity was the foundation of political stability. If everyone worshipped the same way, said the same prayers, attended the same church, and obeyed the same religious authorities, then the kingdom would be orderly. Dissent, even internal dissent, meant fracture, rebellion, and danger, and so religion became a legal mandate, not a personal choice. The most dramatic example of this was the violent pendulum swing of Tudor religious policy. England ricocheted from Catholicism to Protestantism and back again before settling permanently in the Protestant camp. These swings weren't suggestions from the crown, they were commands. Under Henry V, the break from Rome turned loyalty into something measurable by attendance, speech, and silence. You were legally required to acknowledge the king as head of the church. Refusing wasn't stubbornness, it was treason. Under Edward VI, Protestant reforms accelerated. Catholic practices became forbidden. Traditional rituals were criminalised. Religious objects became evidence. People learned that items in their homes, a rosary, a statue, a devotional book, could turn into legal liabilities overnight. Then came Mary VIII, determined to restore Catholicism. Suddenly, the forbidden became required and the required became forbidden. Those who resisted were prosecuted, and in the most notorious cases, burned. Finally, under Elizabeth I, Protestantism returned, not as a preference, but as law. The Act of Uniformity mandated that every person attend Anglican services, follow the Book of Common Prayer, and outwardly adhere to Protestant practice. Recusancy, refusing to attend services, carried escalating fines that could financially ruin a family. Persistent refusal could lead to imprisonment. Private belief was irrelevant. You were judged on the public performance of faith. This meant that church attendance was not optional. You didn't choose whether to go on Sunday. You went because the law said so. If you didn't, someone noticed. Church wardens took attendance, neighbours whispered, constables made inquiries. The parish kept records as meticulously as tax collectors. Skipping church wasn't personal slack. It was an offence, and it wasn't just attendance. Behaviour inside church mattered too. Talking, dozing off, failing to kneel, or reacting incorrectly to mandated rituals could be interpreted as religious defiance. Even coughing at the wrong time might draw attention, especially if someone already suspected you of harbouring forbidden beliefs. Your neighbours became your surveillance network. Everyone watched everyone else, and the stakes were high. Religious nonconformity wasn't treated as a harmless eccentricity. It was interpreted as a threat to the entire kingdom. A person who worshipped incorrectly might spread dissent, weaken unity, or align with foreign enemies. The Tudor state saw a theological disagreement as political treason unfolding in slow motion. Because of this, speech became dangerous. Saying the wrong prayer, quoting the wrong scripture, questioning the monarch's spiritual authority, any of these could lead to legal trouble. Simple conversations about faith carried legal weight. A careless opinion expressed in a tavern could become evidence in court. The most terrifying aspect was that silence itself could be incriminating. If someone asked your opinion on a religious matter and you hesitated, you might be accused of harbouring forbidden beliefs. If asked to swear loyalty to the monarch's religious policy and your voice trembled, someone might report you. Religion was not something you could opt out of. It was compulsory and monitored. Even the architecture of Tudor parishes reinforced this. Churches weren't just places of worship. They were administrative centres where legal notices were proclaimed, fines were recorded, and community discipline was enforced. The pulpit delivered not only sermons, but also state-approved doctrine. Being inside a church meant being inside a legal arena. The home wasn't a sanctuary either. Possessing the wrong religious book, hiding a priest, practicing forbidden rituals, or storing sacred objects could lead to charges. A prayer whispered privately could change the trajectory of your life if overheard. Under Elizabeth, harbouring Catholic priests wasn't simply a religious act, it was felony treason. Saying Mass could lead to imprisonment. Helping someone say Mass could lead to execution. Reading Catholic texts was dangerously suspicious. Even knowing someone who owned them could put you under watch. And yet, Tudor religious law didn't only punish, it also prescribed. It told you how to celebrate feast days, how to baptize your children, how to marry, how to bury the dead, and how to confess sin. Every major life event was regulated. The church ceremony wasn't tradition. It was legally mandated ritual. People adapted. They learned to blend public compliance with private belief. Many families developed double behaviour. Outward conformity for the law, inward loyalty to their own faith. It was spiritual camouflage, a survival skill, a quiet rebellion shaped by fear and necessity. But others were not so lucky. Some refused to compromise. Some resisted silently. Some spoke too boldly. Some were caught between the shifting tides of a royal policy. Their stories ended not in theological debate, but in courtrooms, prisons, and execution grounds. The Tudor state believed that unity of worship meant unity of kingdom, and so it built a system where religion was inseparable from law, identity, and duty. In Tudor England, faith wasn't a matter of the soul. It was a matter of legal compliance. Signed, sealed, witnessed, enforced. Believe correctly. Because incorrect belief didn't just offend God, it offended the crown. In Tudor England, your tongue had a shorter life expectancy than you did. Speech wasn't just communication. It was a hazardous activity requiring judgment, timing, and luck. A casual comment, a whispered joke, a frustrated sigh, even an unfortunate facial expression could drag you into legal catastrophe. Words were not harmless. Words were weapons, and in Tudor law many words were considered pointed directly at the crown. Silence wasn't safety, it was strategy. To understand Tudor speech laws, start with the simple, terrifying truth. Treason included thoughts spoken aloud. You didn't have to take up arms, plot rebellion, or forge alliances with foreign enemies to be accused of treason. You only had to say something the wrong way, to the wrong person, at the wrong time. And wrong covered a lot of ground. Insulting the monarch, treason. Questioning the monarch's judgment, treason. speculating about the monarch's death, treason, complaining loudly that taxes were too high, borderline treason, making jokes about the monarch, a fast track to treason, repeating gossip about royal affairs, suspiciously treason-like. Under Henry VIII, this became especially dangerous. The Treasons Act of 1534 criminalised spoken words that maliciously wished, willed, or desired harm to the king. The key word was maliciously, which was vague enough to swallow entire conversations. If someone disliked you, they could report you for expressing malicious intent, and suddenly you were answering questions in a courtroom with your life hanging in the balance. And what counted as malicious? Whatever the authorities decided. A careless drunk muttering at a tavern about the king's policies could find himself arrested before sobering up. A disgruntled farmer complaining about enclosure might be accused of speaking seditiously. A merchant who grumbled about taxes could be interpreted as agitating discontent. Even a joke, poorly timed and badly heard, could transform into a lethal misunderstanding. Speech was monitored by everyone: friends, family, neighbours, strangers, servants, masters, tavern keepers, and most dangerously, people who disliked you. If someone wanted to get you into trouble, all they needed was a believable story and a willingness to repeat your worst sentence loudly and convincingly. This meant that gossip wasn't harmless. Entertainment, it was evidence. And evidence didn't have to be strong. It only had to exist. Because Tudor justice valued the appearance of loyalty as much as loyalty itself, even small comments were treated with suspicion. Discontent was seen as contagious. One person complaining about the crown could inspire another. Two complaining people constituted a conspiracy. Three or more was practically a rebellion in progress. Speech was monitored precisely because the monarchy feared its power. Words could spark revolts, uprisings, and challenges to authority. Therefore, words had to be controlled. This control extended beyond political speech. Words about religion were equally dangerous. Questioning the monarch's religious policy, criticising sermons, praising banned doctrines, or even discussing scripture in an unapproved way could be interpreted as sedition, heresy, or both. People learned quickly that religious conversations were minefields. The safest theological stance was smiling politely and keeping opinions locked deep inside your skull. This created a strange culture where speech became simultaneously polite and paranoid. Conversations involved an elaborate dance of hinting, implying, and retreating. People developed habits to protect themselves, speaking cautiously, changing subjects quickly, laughing off misunderstandings, pretending not to hear provocative comments, blaming silence on tiredness, hunger, or a heavy mind. The clever learned to speak without speaking, using tone, gesture, or ambiguous phrasing to communicate safely. The less clever learned the hard way. Tudor people perfected the art of the non-committal nod, a survival skill so crucial that failing to use it at the right moment could get you accused of dissent. If someone said something politically questionable, you nodded vaguely, muttered something meaningless like, "Well, God knows all," and backed away slowly. This wasn't cowardice, it was self-preservation. The most perilous situations involved drunkenness. Taverns were notorious for producing treason charges. People who were ordinarily cautious became reckless after ale or wine, forgetting that the walls had ears, and so did the people seated next to them. A drunk farmer slurring complaints about the monarchy could wake up in a cell with a headache, a court date, and a rapidly shrinking future. Even private speech wasn't safe. Husbands and wives could not always trust each other with political opinions. A child repeating something overheard at home could inadvertently condemn the household. Servants, who moved between rooms and households, were repositories of overheard secrets. What you muttered in frustration could reappear days later in a courtroom, spoken much more loudly than you originally said it. Because of this, silence became a learned skill. Not a passive one, an active, strategic, deliberate silence. People learned when not to speak, when to pretend ignorance, when to avoid conversations entirely. This wasn't shyness, it was survival. The Crown reinforced this culture of controlled speech through public trials. People watched neighbours and strangers punished for spoken words and internalised the lesson. If you cannot control the king's power, control your tongue. The emotional impact of these trials was immense. People saw ordinary individuals dragged into court for sentences that lasted only seconds. They saw how fragile freedom became when speech itself was dangerous. Over time, Tudor society developed an unspoken rule. The less you say, the more you live. Words had consequences. Silence had value. Speech was a blade, and every Tudor carried it in their mouth. In a kingdom where monarchs changed policies suddenly, and where political winds shifted without warning, your safest ally wasn't courage or honesty. It was caution. Silence wasn't safety. Silence was strategy. If you picture a Tudor trial as a slow, dignified procession toward truth, complete with careful deliberation, thoughtful judges, and a healthy respect for evidence, erase that image immediately. Tudor trials were fast, chaotic, and deeply biased, more like theatrical performances than judicial processes. They were held not to find the truth, but to confirm what officials already believed. The trial was quick, the outcome already packed. To begin with, Tudor courts operated at astonishing speed. Many trials lasted under an hour, some lasted minutes. There were no long jury discussions, no stacks of presented evidence, no thoughtful pauses where judges stroked their chins, contemplating fairness. The structure of a trial was ritualistic, not investigative. The authorities walked in with assumptions, and the legal machinery existed to turn those assumptions into punishments. The process began with what the Tudors generously called evidence. But evidence meant something very different then. It did not require physical proof, motives, or even logic. It could include neighbours' suspicions, rumours repeated confidently, a constable's opinion, the defendant's demeanour, circumstantial impressions, and, most dangerously, the judge's instinct. This wasn't a flaw in the system. This was the system. The courtroom itself reflected this imbalance. Judges, justices of the peace, sheriffs and local officials sat or stood with visible authority. Defendants stood with visible discomfort. There were no defence lawyers for common people. You represented yourself, whether or not you knew anything about the law, and most people didn't know anything about the law. This meant the accused often faced a room full of educated, powerful men whose job was not to help them understand the charge, but to push the process toward a predetermined conclusion. The courtroom language was formal and difficult. Questions were phrased in ways that confused the uneducated. Many defendants didn't even fully grasp what they were accused of until the punishment was announced. And the judge's personality played an enormous role. There were no standardized sentencing guidelines, no consistent protocols, and no expectation of neutrality. One judge might be stern but fair. Another might be vindictive, impatient, or in a foul mood because his horse slipped on the way to court. The law was a tool, the judge was the hand, the defendant was the nail. Trials relied heavily on oaths, because in a world with little documentation, swearing an oath carried enormous weight. Witnesses who took an oath were presumed truthful, even if everyone in the village knew they were terrible liars. Meanwhile, defendants who swore their innocence often did so under suspicion. If they hesitated, it meant guilt. If they swore too quickly, it meant guilt. If they avoided swearing at all, it meant guilt with extra steps. And the jury, forget the idea of independent thinkers weighing arguments carefully. Tudor juries were typically local men who already knew the defendant, already heard the rumours, already held personal opinions, already understood what verdict the authorities expected. Jurors who delivered verdicts unpopular with local officials risked being fined or punished themselves. So even when a jury had doubts, they rarely acted on them. Being brave wasn't encouraged in Tudor courts. Being obedient was. The most dramatic part of a trial came with the accusations, which were sometimes read aloud in flowery, exaggerated language by clerks who seemed to be enjoying themselves. Being accused of stealing a chicken became maliciously taking and carrying away a fowl of notable value. Being accused of disturbing the peace became riotously assembling with wicked intent. The more dramatic the wording, the more legitimate the accusation sounded. If someone was accused of a serious offence, especially treason or subversive speech, the trial became even more lopsided. The Crown's interest dominated everything. The defendant's guilt was often assumed before they entered the room. Trial procedure existed to formalise the conclusion, not test it. Confessions played a huge role, but Tudor confessions were not always voluntary. Torture, psychological pressure, threats against family members, or simply the terrifying atmosphere of the courtroom often pushed defendants to admit wrongdoing, even when they were innocent. A confession solved the problem neatly, and courts preferred neatness over accuracy. For lesser crimes, trials took place in quarter sessions or manorial courts, which were even more informal. These local trials resembled community meetings more than judicial proceedings. People wandered in and out, chatter filled the room, and the accused faced questions from people who might also be their neighbours, landlords, or rivals. In such settings, justice was influenced by local gossip, personal grudges, family reputation, the mood of the officials, the season, harvest time meant, shorter patience, and even whether the judge liked your father. Some defendants didn't even speak during their trials. The court spoke for them. The accusation was read, witnesses nodded dramatically, the judge announced the verdict, and that was that. The trial ended quickly, with little ceremony and no opportunity for defence. Punishments were often immediate. Once the verdict was given, the constable took the defendant to the stocks, the whipping post, or, in the worst cases, straight to the execution site. Appeals were rare, expensive, and usually pointless. Most people didn't even know appeals existed. The speed of the trials wasn't considered a flaw, but a virtue. A swift legal system was believed to maintain order and discourage troublemakers, but speed came with cost. Truth was often irrelevant. Fairness was optional. Justice was whatever the authorities needed it to be that day. A Tudor trial wasn't a search for answers. It was a ritual of confirmation. The judge declared. The jury nodded. The spectators murmured, and the accused stared, realising that their fate had been decided before the first question was even asked. The trial was quick, the outcome already packed. In Tudor England, torture wasn't an undercover practice carried out in shadowy chambers with deniable whispers and hidden chains. It was an openly acknowledged tool of interrogation, unpleasant, intimidating, and entirely acceptable to the people who wielded it. The point wasn't to uncover truth, it was to produce cooperation. Truth was optional, pain was not. For the Tudors, a confession was the crown jewel of any investigation. Confessions were seen as the purest proof of guilt, the clearest demonstration of wrongdoing, the easiest path to conviction. Whether the confession was accurate, coerced, misunderstood, or mumbled through tears mattered very little. A confession was final, clean, efficient, and the quickest way to obtain one was through examination by force. That was the polite phrase. The realistic phrase was torture. But Tudor torture wasn't used on just anyone. In theory, only the most serious cases, usually treason, justified it. In practice, however, serious was a flexible category. If an official wanted a confession badly enough, circumstances had a way of becoming serious. And torture didn't require a guilty person. It required a convenient one. The most infamous instrument in the system was the rack, a long wooden frame fitted with rollers and ropes. The victim was tied down, wrists and ankles bound securely, and the interrogator turned the handles to stretch the body. Muscles tore, joints dislocated, sinews snapped. Pain radiated through the limbs like fire. The rack didn't kill, at least not immediately. Its purpose was to make resistance impossible. If you didn't speak before the rack, you spoke during it. If you still didn't speak, you whispered something afterward in the desperate hope of survival. And what you whispered was taken as fact. The rack was so iconic that even its lesser-known cousin, the scavenger's daughter, evoked terror. Instead of stretching the body, this iron device crushed it, folding the victim tightly until chest met knees, compressing ribs, lungs, and spine. Blood vessels burst. Breathing became a desperate act. Pain overwhelmed the senses. It was a grotesque contrast to the rack, offering the same result through the opposite method. 2 devices, 2 directions. One pulled you apart, one collapsed you inward. Both reached the same legal goal, a confession. Other interrogation techniques were equally creative. The manacles, for instance, were deceptively simple. Heavy iron cuffs hung from the ceiling. The prisoner's wrists were placed inside and suspended for hours or even days. Shoulders dislocated under the body's weight. Muscles trembled. Circulation collapsed. People fainted, revived, fainted again. The pain was endless, unavoidable, consuming. Then there was sleep deprivation, a quieter method but no less brutal. Prisoners were kept awake night after night, questioned relentlessly, denied rest until their minds blurred and their sense of reality fractured. After enough sleepless hours, a person would confess to anything. Crimes, conspiracies, imaginary plots, or whatever the interrogator needed. Fire was used too in the form of heated irons or candle flames held close to bare skin. These persuasion methods weren't officially classified as torture, but everyone understood exactly what they were. Pain was pain, regardless of the labels attached, and none of this was secret. Torture happened in recognisable places, often within the Tower of London, sometimes in local jails or chambers designated for examination. Officials didn't hide their tools, they displayed them. The presence of these devices acted as a silent threat, one that spoke louder than any legal document. The process was straightforward. Step 1, accuse. Step 2, question. Step 3, apply pressure. Step 4, produce confession. Whether the confession made sense was irrelevant. Officials weren't looking for clarity, they were looking for closure. A confession allowed the court to move forward without ambiguity. It also allowed the authorities to claim moral victory. After all, the accused admitted it. Case closed. This preference for confession over truth created absurd circumstances. People sometimes confessed to crimes they didn't commit, events they didn't witness, plots they didn't know existed, or details they couldn't possibly have understood. Truth bent under the weight of pain. Memories blurred. Imagination filled gaps. And interrogators rarely questioned inconsistencies. A person might name accomplices who had never met. They might describe conspiracies that never happened. They might remember details fed to them by interrogators. But once spoken, the words turned into evidence. Pain made lies sound believable, and once a confession was obtained, mercy depended entirely on the court. Sometimes torture victims were released with permanent injuries. Sometimes they were crippled for life. Sometimes they were executed anyway. The confession merely expedited the process. Torture didn't guarantee survival, it guaranteed compliance. The emotional toll was equally devastating. Many victims left interrogation chambers with psychological scars that lasted longer than the physical ones. Trauma, fear, disorientation, shame. These lingered long after the devices stopped turning. Yet the Tudor state justified torture not as cruelty, but as necessity. Officials believed truth required encouragement. Loyalty must be protected at any cost. Resistance was proof of guilt. Pain purified confessions. This logic allowed torture to flourish as a normal accepted feature of governance. The public rarely witnessed the torture itself, but they witnessed its results. They saw broken bodies brought to trial. They heard trembling confessions. They watched as accused persons echoed the exact narratives authorities wanted repeated, and they learned the lesson the state intended. Do not resist. Do not question. Do not speak unwisely. Do not give anyone a reason to turn the handles or tighten the screws. Because in Tudor England, truth was a luxury. Pain was a guarantee. And when the two collided, the law always favoured the one it could inflict. In Tudor England, mercy technically existed, in the same way a decorative sword on the wall technically counts as a weapon. It was visible, impressive, awe-inspiring, and completely unpredictable. Mercy wasn't a right. It wasn't a process. It wasn't even a hope. Mercy was a performance, a symbol, a flourish of royal power designed to remind everyone that the monarch could spare a life as easily as they ended one. Mercy wasn't justice. It was branding. The entire concept of royal mercy revolved around one idea. The crown's power was absolute, but occasionally, for dramatic effect, sovereigns liked to pause their own thunder. A pardon didn't mean the justice system had reconsidered. It meant the monarch had chosen to gesture benevolence, like tossing a single loaf of bread into a starving crowd and waiting for applause. Royal mercy came in many forms: full pardons, commuted sentences, delayed executions, remissions of fines, occasional reprieves. Every version carried the same message: your life is mine to take or return, and today I happen to be generous. But generosity was rarely the point. Mercy was political currency. Take full pardons, for example. These were often issued during major celebrations: a coronation, a royal wedding, a military victory, or the birth of an heir. The reasoning wasn't mysterious. Big events needed big gestures. A few prisoners would be released as public proof that the kingdom was overflowing with royal grace. Families wept with joy. Crowds cheered. The monarch basked in the glow of manufactured goodwill. Yet the people pardoned during these events weren't always chosen for innocence, nor for small offences. Sometimes hardened criminals walked free. Sometimes minor offenders remained locked up. Mercy was not fairness. Mercy was spectacle. The crown also used mercy strategically to reinforce loyalty. Nobles who pledged their allegiance at the right moment might receive pardons for themselves or their allies. Wealthy families might petition the monarch with expensive gifts, subtle flattery, and letters full of trembling devotion. A well-timed gesture could collapse a death sentence into fines or banishment. Meanwhile, a poor prisoner, equally deserving, rotted in a cell with no contacts, no advocates, and no hope. Even outside the royal court, mercy functioned as a tool of hierarchy. Justices of the peace, sheriffs, and local officials had limited power to show leniency, but their decisions were equally unpredictable. A JP might reduce a sentence because he personally liked the offender's family, or increase it because the offender's father once insulted him at a feast. Leniency was a matter of personality, not principle. A sympathetic judge could grant a reprieve. A grumpy one could end your life. The legal system didn't oppose this inconsistency. It depended on it. Part of the allure of mercy was its rarity. It was supposed to surprise people. A justice system built on fear needed the occasional lightning bolt of mercy to feel balanced. Not truly balanced, but theatrically balanced. A kingdom dripping with terror became tiresome. Fear worked better when it had a shadow of hope behind it. But mercy was never a guarantee. A prisoner could spend months believing a pardon was coming. A rumour whispered by a sympathetic constable, a promise from a friend of a friend, a letter sent by a distant cousin, only to discover on execution day that hope was the last, lie before the drop. Families clung to hope because the alternative was impossible to endure. The crown knew this. It understood the emotional weight of mercy, which made withholding it even more powerful. Even when mercy arrived, it came tangled in conditions. A sentence commuted from death to imprisonment was mercy. A branding instead of hanging was mercy. Surviving the ordeal but carrying lifelong scars was still mercy. Tudor people learned to accept brutal compromises as blessings. Mercy, after all, was not designed for fairness. It was designed for effect. Petitions for mercy were common. Some were heartfelt pleas written in trembling handwriting. Others were elaborate performances full of poetic flourishes meant to flatter the monarch's ego. A well-crafted appeal might include declarations of loyalty, dramatic recounting of misfortune, weeping wives or mothers pleading publicly, exaggerated tales of repentance, appeals to Christian charity, reminders of one's service to the crown, but none of these mattered unless the monarch, or the official holding power, felt moved, amused, politically interested, or momentarily soft-hearted. The most bizarre aspect of Tudor mercy was how it could create permanent legal branding. People who received pardons often carried documents detailing their offence, the pardon, and their conditions of freedom. These papers had to be shown constantly to prove legitimacy. In a way, the pardon stamped their identity forever. Mercy didn't erase the crime, it preserved it in writing, and the public never forgot either. A person spared the gallows lived with the reputation of someone who had stood on the edge and returned only because the monarch allowed it. Instead of being seen as innocent, many became curiosities, reminders that the king or queen had the power of life and death. In this way, mercy reinforced hierarchy more effectively than punishment. Punishment demonstrated authority. Mercy demonstrated authority wrapped in benevolence. Together they created a system where the crown appeared both fearsome and fatherly, terrifying and tender, cruel and compassionate, depending on the king's mood, the court's politics, and the spectator's needs. For the Tudors, justice was the machinery of control. Mercy was the decoration, a decoration that glittered when the crown wanted applause, a decoration withheld when the crown wanted obedience, a decoration granted not by fairness, but by whim. Mercy wasn't justice, it wasn't equality, it wasn't redemption, it was branding, a royal signature stamped on someone's survival. In Tudor England, the law wasn't a stable structure. It didn't sit quietly in books, predictable and permanent. It moved, it swerved, it transformed. It woke up on different sides of the bed depending on who sat on the throne or what political gust blew through court. The law wasn't a foundation, it was weather, and you were expected to survive it. Yesterday legal, today treason. If there is a single truth about Tudor law, it's this: nothing stayed the same for long. The monarchy had absolute authority, Parliament cooperated enthusiastically when told to, and royal proclamations could alter the legal landscape overnight. This created a kingdom where ordinary people had to navigate laws that changed faster than rumours could travel. You didn't just obey the law, you chased it, breathlessly, anxiously, and often unsuccessfully. The root of legal instability was the monarchy's political and religious volatility. Every Tudor ruler reshaped the kingdom according to their beliefs, fears, ambitions, and enemies. A new monarch meant a new era, sometimes literally the instant the crown touched their head. Henry VIII redefined the nation with sweeping changes to church authority, property laws, and treason statutes. Edward VI swung the country sharply toward Protestant reforms. Mary the Knife reversed those reforms, reinstated Catholic doctrine, and punished offenders accordingly. Elizabeth of England swung it back again, crafting a Protestant system built on national identity and quiet suspicion. The law followed these swings like a flag in the wind. This meant an action that was faithful under one ruler became criminal under the next. A prayer whispered safely yesterday could be forbidden today. Owning a devotional object that warmed your heart under one monarch could be grounds for arrest under another. Even silence, the safest strategy, became risky during transitions. Silence could be interpreted as loyalty to the wrong side, and ordinary people had no control over these shifts. You didn't get a memo explaining updated laws. You didn't receive a helpful pamphlet outlining the new forbidden words, banned books, or altered taxes. You heard changes through church announcements, market gossip, travelling officials or panicked neighbours. Information arrived incomplete, distorted or too late. Imagine waking up to discover that an item in your home was now contraband, a prayer you used was now heresy, a book you owned was now treasonous, a neighbour's behaviour required reporting, a ceremony you practised was now illegal, and ignorance was not a defence. This was Tudor life, a country where the law didn't reward obedience, it rewarded awareness. Even economic laws changed abruptly. Grain regulations fluctuated with famine, poor harvests, or political pressure. Wages, work requirements, market rules, and price controls appeared suddenly, often enforced immediately. A merchant might follow yesterday's rules perfectly, and still be fined today for breaking ones he hadn't heard about yet. The legal system didn't consider confusion a valid excuse. If you broke a new rule, the assumption was simple: you should have known. Whether you could have known was irrelevant. This instability created a psychological landscape of constant caution. People spoke carefully, acted predictably, avoided risk, and monitored the behaviour of those around them. You weren't just trying to obey laws, you were trying to predict them. Predicting Tudor laws was like predicting the mood of the weather. Possible in theory, hopeless in practice. Political circumstances also shaped sudden legal changes. Wars, rebellions, and diplomatic fears triggered emergency statutes. A rebellion in the north could lead to harsher penalties for harbouring strangers in the south. A foreign threat might produce new speech restrictions. A failed harvest could spark new vagrancy regulations. And because these rules came without warning, people often broke them accidentally before learning they existed. Even loyalty became a volatile legal category. During transitions, especially after a monarch's death, suspicion hung in the air. People who had openly supported the previous ruler's beliefs or policies had to pivot instantly, without appearing too enthusiastic lest they seem opportunistic, or too slow lest they seem disloyal. A single miscalculated expression could define you. A pause during an oath, a delay attending a mandated service, a reluctance to discard a banned object. These were tiny actions with enormous stakes in a system where laws were both a weapon and a trap. Religious laws were the most notorious for sudden reversals, but political laws could be just as dangerous. Elite families fell out of favour overnight. Advisors found themselves accused of conspiracy by rivals eager to reshape the court. Policies that benefited one faction were destroyed when that faction lost influence. Survival required not just loyalty, but flexibility and luck. Even the punishments for crimes changed. A crime deemed worthy of branding one year might be upgraded to execution the next. Courts enforced new penalties immediately, whether or not defendants had time to adjust. Judges followed the current handbook of royal preference, a shifting unwritten code that everyone pretended was stable. This left ordinary people with one strategy: minimize visibility. Don't stand out. Don't attract attention. Don't be too devout. Don't be insufficiently devout. Don't seem too wealthy. Don't seem too poor. Don't voice opinions. Don't stay silent if officials expect enthusiasm. Living under ever-changing laws meant living in a constant state of recalibration. Tudor subjects learned to watch the monarch's speeches, courtiers' behaviour, clergy announcements, and political rumours as carefully as sailors watch the wind. The direction of the law was a matter of survival. In the end, Tudor law wasn't simply unstable. It was strategically unstable. It kept the population alert, obedient, and fearful of missteps. A population guessing the rules was a population that couldn't unite, rebel, or coordinate resistance. Yesterday legal, today treason, wasn't just a witty exaggeration. It was a fact of daily life. Erasers, edge every subject walked on, hoping each step wouldn't land on a law that hadn't existed the day before. And by the time you found out the rules changed, it was often because someone you knew had already been punished. If you imagine that Tudor law stopped at your doorstep, that once you crossed into your cottage, your business became your own, you would be magnificently, dangerously wrong. The Tudor state believed privacy was a loophole, and loopholes were threats. Home wasn't a sanctuary, a refuge, or a protective bubble. It was simply the next jurisdiction. Home wasn't safe, it was inspected. Tudor law wrapped itself around your domestic life with the enthusiasm of a vine growing up a wall, creeping into corners, peering through cracks and finding its way into every room whether you invited it or not. Almost everything you did at home, how you behaved, what you owned, how you cooked, who visited, when you slept, how you disciplined children, how you organised, your work, was subject to community scrutiny and legal oversight, and the community was always watching. Let's start with the simplest intrusion: household order. Tudor law assumed the head of each household, which meant the husband, was responsible for maintaining discipline, morality, and productivity under his roof. If your home was chaotic, the law didn't view it as unfortunate. It viewed it as suspicious. A family that lacked household discipline could easily slip into idleness, disobedience, or religious inconsistency. So officials monitored homes for signs of disorder: neglected children, unwashed linens, excessive noise, suspiciously frequent visitors, arguments that spilled into the street, or even smoke at strange hours. A disorderly house wasn't just embarrassing, it could be seen as a threat to the social fabric. And because houses were small, walls thin, and neighbours energetically attentive, privacy was less a right and more a rumour. Domestic violence, for example, wasn't purely a personal matter. Husbands were legally permitted to discipline their wives reasonably, but if they went too far, the community stepped in, not necessarily to protect the woman, but because excessive disturbance meant the household had failed in its legal duty of order. A wife who screamed too loudly or too often could trigger an inquiry, not out of compassion, out of civic responsibility. On the flip side, if a wife was too argumentative or scolded too publicly, the community could punish her, even though the root issue took place at home. The law didn't care where disorder started. It only cared that disorder existed. Then there were household visitors, which were never just social choices. Hosting the wrong person, a known troublemaker, a suspected dissenter, a stranger without clear origins, or someone labelled morally questionable, could place you under legal suspicion. Parish officers tracked who boarded travellers, who provided food or lodging to wanderers, and who welcomed guests during hours considered inappropriate. And heaven help you if you offered shelter to someone the law considered a vagrant. That wasn't kindness. That was aiding crime. Even domestic work was overseen. Brewing at home was extremely common, but brewing too much, selling without a licence, or producing low-quality ale was legally punishable. Yes, bad ale could get you in trouble. Inspectors visited homes to check measurements, tools, ingredients, and selling practices. A sour brew wasn't merely disappointing, it was prosecutable. Food preparation also fell under scrutiny. Bakers and butchers were regulated publicly, but householders could be reprimanded for keeping meat too long, storing grain improperly, or wasting food, all of which could be interpreted as potential deception or hoarding. In times of scarcity, officials inspected homes for hidden grain stores. If you stocked too much, you weren't prudent. You were a problem. Fire, the centrepiece of Tudor domestic life, was also aggressively regulated. Chimneys required cleaning. Sparks escaping the hearth could be reported. A thatched roof too close to another posed legal danger. A fire left unattended wasn't the result of fatigue. It was negligence, and negligence threatened entire neighbourhoods. One person's mistake could burn the village, so the law stepped into living rooms to make sure you didn't accidentally set everyone ablaze. And let's talk about curfew enforcement. Many towns imposed nighttime restrictions, which didn't just apply outside, they applied inside too. If candlelight escaped your window after hours, neighbours noticed, and constables took notes. Staying awake late could look suspicious. Why were you up? What were you doing? What were you hiding? If you wanted privacy after dark, too bad. The law had bedtime rules. Then there were the Sunday regulations. The Sabbath wasn't simply a spiritual expectation. It was a legal mandate. Doing laundry on Sunday? Illegal. Mending clothes? Illegal. Brewing? Illegal. Sweeping? Technically illegal. Any labour within the household risked fines. If you were caught chopping vegetables too energetically on the Sabbath, a neighbour might accuse you of dishonouring God with excessive activity. Your home life was not your own. Your routines were public business. Moral surveillance extended to romantic and sexual behaviour too. If an unmarried couple spent too much time together, the community noticed. If a widow had visitors at night, the parish whispered. If a newly married couple behaved too affectionately in public, that could even appear in court records as light behaviour. Tudor law blurred the lines between morality and legality until they disappeared entirely. Even childbirth brought officials to your door. Neighbours monitored pregnancies closely. If a woman delivered a baby suspiciously early, the timeline was noted and could lead to accusations of fornication. If a woman miscarried in private, she risked being accused of concealing a pregnancy or committing infanticide. In some regions, women were required to summon witnesses during labour, specifically to prove the child had been born alive. Death within the household was also regulated. Bodies couldn't be buried without proper inspection, documentation, and church rites. If a death appeared unusual, officials entered the home to investigate, interview family members, and ensure nothing illegal had occurred. Your grief didn't matter. The law needed answers. But perhaps the most invasive feature of Tudor domestic regulation was the poor relief system. Parish authorities entered homes to evaluate who needed aid, who deserved it, and, more importantly, who didn't. They checked cleanliness, child behaviour, food storage, and sleeping arrangements. A family deemed insufficiently tidy or morally upright could lose support entirely. Poverty wasn't just visible, it was inspected. All of this created a world where the home, the one place modern people assume to be private, was simply another stage of public life. A household that appeared peaceful, orderly, and obedient survived. A household that slipped, even briefly, triggered scrutiny. In Tudor England, the walls of your home didn't shield you. They acted like thin parchment. Everything echoed through them. Everything was visible through them. Everything could become evidence. Home wasn't safe. It was inspected, regularly, thoroughly, and with great enthusiasm. In Tudor England, strangers were not greeted with curiosity, excitement, or a friendly, "Where have you come from?" They were greeted with suspicion so thick you could spread it on bread. Being foreign wasn't a crime, technically, but it might as well have been, because the law treated outsiders with a level of scrutiny normally reserved for criminals, traitors, and people who baked bread on the wrong day. Different wasn't illegal, it was suspicious. The Tudor worldview was intensely local. People lived their entire lives within walking distance of where they were born. They knew the faces, habits, families, sins, and gossip of everyone in their parish. A stranger stepping into this ecosystem was like a spark falling into dry tinder. Questions began immediately. Who is he? Why is he here? Who sent her? Is this how rebellions begin? These weren't rude questions, they were legal ones. The administrative heart of Tudor xenophobia was the simple belief that outsiders disrupted order. A person with no local ties couldn't be trusted. They might not respect community rules, might not pay dues, might not attend church properly, and worst of all, might bring foreign ideas or influences, a fate Tudor England considered almost as dangerous as plague. Because of this, multiple laws were written specifically to control movement. Anyone travelling into a new town was expected to present proof of origin, a settlement certificate, a master's letter, or endorsement from a parish. Without documentation, a traveller was viewed not as a guest but as a vagrant or potential criminal. The scrutiny wasn't limited to foreigners from distant lands. In Tudor logic, A stranger from the next county over might as well have been a visitor from the moon. If someone didn't speak like you, dress like you, or worship in familiar patterns, their presence triggered watchfulness. Local officials kept lists of suspicious newcomers. Parish constables recorded where they slept, what they bought, whom they spoke to, and whether they had means of support. You could be perfectly innocent and still find officials dropping by your lodgings to ask probing questions like, "What exactly is your purpose in this county? Who can vouch for your character? Why were you walking alone after sunset?" You could answer honestly, but honesty wasn't always enough. Although Tudor England had limited diversity compared to later centuries, it was not isolated. Traders, sailors, musicians, scholars, and artisans travelled from France, Flanders, Spain, Italy, North Africa, and beyond. These individuals contributed to English culture significantly, introducing new skills, fashions, and ideas, but legally they walked a tightrope. Foreign craftsmen were sometimes welcomed for their skills, especially in trades like weaving or metalwork, but even then guilds complained bitterly. English workers petitioned Parliament repeatedly to restrict foreign competition. These petitions worked. Laws were passed to limit the economic freedoms of aliens, requiring them to work only under English masters or imposing extra taxes. This wasn't economics. This was controlled tolerance. And while economic outsiders were tolerated grudgingly, cultural outsiders were treated far more harshly. People with accents, unusual clothing, or unfamiliar customs automatically attracted suspicion. Locals called them strangers, a term that blurred the lines between foreignness and social threat. A stranger didn't simply lack a home, they lacked a place in local hierarchy. Parishes feared strangers because they might spread new religious ideas, disrupt labour markets, commit crimes and vanish, require financial support, or, the ultimate fear, participate in espionage. England was often at war or diplomatic tension with France, Spain, and Scotland. This turned many foreign-born residents into potential enemies in the public imagination. Being Spanish during Mary the One's reign brought benefits. Being Spanish during Elizabeth I's reign brought suspicion. Being French during conflict with France was likewise dangerous. Political tensions shifted the acceptable foreigner list constantly. But the law saved its harshest suspicion for those who were unfamiliar in more subtle ways. Outsiders within England, a travelling student, a wandering labourer, a woman from a neighbouring shire, a sailor from a distant port. To Tudor eyes, unfamiliar people were unpredictable, and unpredictability was treated as a warning sign. The fear extended to cultures considered radically different. Darker-skinned travellers, North African sailors, or people with distinctive dress were stared at, questioned, and often followed. Not because the law forbade their presence, but because the law encouraged communities to police difference. Parish officers wrote complaints about exotic strangers in ways that revealed both fascination and hostility. Even celebrity outsiders, like travelling performers or musicians, drew suspicion. Entertainers from abroad were welcomed on stage but watched like hawks off stage. Foreign tricks might charm crowds but alarm church officials. Religious outsiders fared the worst. Foreign Catholics during Protestant rule, or foreign Protestants during Catholic rule, lived in constant danger. Hosting the wrong person for dinner could make you look like a conspirator. Speaking courteously to a foreign priest could draw questions. Strangers became magnets for legal attention because their beliefs were unknown, unverified, or rumoured. All of this scrutiny occurred against the backdrop of parish responsibility laws, which held local communities accountable for their poor. If a stranger became destitute, the parish that admitted them had to pay. This turned outsiders into not just social threats, but financial liabilities. A weary traveller entering town wasn't merely unfamiliar, they were expensive. It's no wonder parish officials frequently marched newcomers straight to the border and instructed them to go home, even if home was hundreds of miles away. But xenophobia wasn't solely institutional. It lived in Tudor conversations, whispers, speculation, side-eye looks, involuntary tightening of posture when a stranger entered the market. Suspicion became a reflex, and yet, despite the fear, many outsiders carved out lives in Tudor England. Some married locals, some became respected tradespeople, and some melted into the social structure so effectively that their foreign origins became minor footnotes. But the legal climate never truly forgot, nor forgave, nor relaxed its watch. In Tudor England, strangers existed under constant evaluation, their differences magnified by law, fear, and rumour. Different wasn't illegal, it didn't have to be. Suspicion did the work on its own. If you walked into a Tudor courtroom expecting justice, truth, vindication, or anything resembling moral clarity, you were in the wrong century. Tudor justice wasn't designed to be fair. It wasn't designed to be compassionate. It wasn't designed to seek truth. Its purpose was far simpler, colder, and far more efficient. Maintain order at all costs. The law didn't care if it was right. It cared if it worked. To modernise, justice and fairness feel linked. In Tudor England, they were distant cousins who rarely visited each other. The legal system wasn't built to ensure equality or protect individual rights. It was designed to prevent chaos, rebellion, disorder, disobedience, and anything that threatened the fragile stability of a kingdom that seemed to reinvent itself every decade. Order was the goal. Fairness was optional. To understand Tudor justice, you must understand Tudor fear. The monarchy was perpetually anxious about enemies abroad, rivals at home, unpredictable religions, wandering workers, volatile harvests, and the ever-present possibility that the population might decide it had had enough of royal experimentation. A single rumour could ignite rebellion. One charismatic troublemaker could destabilise entire regions. So the law evolved into a weapon for control, not a shield for the innocent. The philosophy was simple. A predictable society was a safe society, a frightened society was a manageable society, and a submissive society was an ideal one. Every law, punishment, and courtroom ritual reflected this. Fairness didn't maintain stability, fear did. Take harsh penalties, for example. The goal of punishment wasn't to match the crime morally, it was to create a spectacle so vivid that no one else dared imitate it. Theft might bring hanging not because the crime was monstrous, but because the consequences needed to be unforgettable. Public punishments, stocks, pillories, mutilation weren't medieval leftovers. They were psychological strategies. Justice wasn't about the offender, it was about the audience. Watching someone branded for the rest of their life did more to reinforce obedience than any sermon or lecture. A thief punished harshly became a walking billboard for royal authority. Disobey, and this could be you. Pain was a tool. Shame was a tool. Fear was the most efficient tool of all. Even the design of Tudor trials served the philosophy of order over fairness. Trials were quick, decisive, and heavily biased toward conviction, because long, complicated judicial processes created uncertainty, the enemy of stability. Certainty, even when unjust, brought clarity. People understood what happened to troublemakers. They understood where the boundaries were drawn, even if they didn't always make sense. The worst thing a legal system could produce was ambiguity. Ambiguity inspired boldness. Boldness inspired disobedience. Justice wasn't supposed to be questioned. Justice was supposed to be obeyed. The emphasis on order explains why intention rarely mattered. Accidents could be punished severely if they threatened public safety. Words spoken in frustration could be interpreted as treason. Poverty was treated as a crime because poor wandering people disrupted the expected social structure. Even private behaviours, if they created enough noise or gossip, became legal matters because they disturbed community harmony. Morality didn't drive prosecution. Public perception did. The Tudor state prized obedience over innocence, submission over explanation, conformity over reasoning. If someone threatened the system, intentionally or accidentally, They needed to be neutralized quickly to prevent copycats. The system didn't ask, "What made you do this?" It asked, "How do we make sure no one else does?" This meant justice was deeply preventative. Laws existed not for the crimes already committed, but for the crimes officials feared might happen. Suspicion was often treated as guilt. Being likely to cause trouble was almost as dangerous as causing it. This mindset explains the enormous power given to local officials. Constables, church wardens, and justices were empowered to handle small disturbances rapidly, decisively, and publicly. If someone caused a scene, insulted a neighbour, or disrupted Sunday service, the goal wasn't to understand the root cause. The goal was to restore order immediately, and with force if necessary. People often feared local justice more than royal justice because local officials cared less about principles and more about peace. A disruptive household, quarrelsome spouse, or suspicious newcomer could find themselves punished swiftly in the name of community stability. In this worldview, fairness was actually dangerous. Too much fairness slowed things down. Too much fairness encouraged people to argue, to question, to challenge authority. All risks the system wanted to smother. Orderly injustice was preferable to chaotic fairness. Even religious law followed this philosophy. The Crown didn't enforce faith because it cared about private belief. It enforced faith because religious disagreement bred rebellion. Uniform worship meant a uniform kingdom. Conformity kept the peace. A single heretic, if tolerated, could become a symbol of resistance, and symbols were dangerous. Truth was a luxury. Order was the priority, and perhaps nothing illustrates Tudor legal philosophy more clearly than the way the state handled mercy. Mercy wasn't granted for fairness, it was granted for effect. Executions, pardons, and commutations were tools in the same toolkit, used to reinforce authority, reward obedience, or pacify unrest. Justice, mercy, punishment. They were all parts of the same machinery, a machine built to maintain structure, not morality. This is why Tudor subjects learned to live cautiously. People didn't avoid crime because it was immoral. They avoided crime because punishment was swift, public, and deliberately frightening. People didn't follow religious policies out of spiritual conviction. They followed them because deviating was dangerous. People didn't trust courts to discover truth. They trusted courts to restore order, which often meant sacrificing truth entirely. In the end, Tudor justice wasn't a moral compass or a rational guide. It was a stabilizer, a hard, unyielding system built to keep the kingdom predictable, controlled, and obedient. Fairness was never the point. Fairness didn't keep the peace. Fear did. The law didn't care if it was right. It cared if it worked, and it worked best when everyone stayed in line. The good news, you survived the Tudor legal system. The bad news, that means you learned when to stay quiet. By the time you reach the end of a life lived under Tudor law, survival isn't measured by wealth, comfort, or achievement. It's measured by adaptation. You didn't survive because the system protected you. You survived because you learned how to move within it without drawing attention, without stepping out of line, and without speaking at the wrong moment. Survival was less triumph and more skill. You learned to read the room, even when you couldn't read the law. You learned to nod when powerful people spoke, to listen when dangerous subjects arose, and to fold yourself into the rhythm of a world that demanded obedience for its own sake. You learned that justice was a performance, fairness was a rumour, and safety was something you earned through constant vigilance. You didn't just avoid breaking the law, you avoided being noticed by it. Tudor law followed you like weather, unpredictable, shifting, occasionally calm, often threatening. It was a presence that never stepped aside, never turned its back, never offered the luxury of forgetting it existed. And after years of living under that pressure, you developed instincts, quiet ones, sharp ones. You learned that the monarch's word changed reality, and wisdom meant adapting before anyone asked you to. You watched rulers tear down old laws, rebuild new ones, reverse policies overnight, and expect immediate conformity. You didn't protest. Protesting was hazardous to your health. But you learned to pivot quickly. The same prayer that kept you safe one year could condemn you the next. You memorized whichever version was required. You learned to survive by listening more than speaking. Because in Tudor England, ears kept you alive. Mouths ended careers, or lives. Your home wasn't safe from scrutiny, so you learned to keep order. Not because you loved neatness, but because disorder brought attention. Neighbours became witnesses. Visitors became liabilities. You locked your doors not just against thieves, but against rumours. You learned to treat strangers with polite distance, not out of cruelty, but out of pure survival instinct. Outsiders meant unpredictability, and unpredictability meant legal danger. So you kept your head down, your circle small, and your movements predictable. Even your children learned the choreography early. A child didn't get to wait until adulthood to understand consequences. The law taught them fast, you taught them faster, and through all this, you became a quiet expert in the most important Tudor survival skill, interpreting the mood of authority. Was the constable in a rush? Good. Fewer questions. Was the justice of the peace cheerful? Excellent. Sentencing might be lighter. Was the minister in a severe mood during Sunday service? Time to look more devout than usual. You learn to manage risk through observation, not rights. Because the Tudor state didn't give you rights, it gave you obligations. The poor learned this in the harshest way. Poverty was never treated as misfortune, but as offence. So you worked relentlessly, not always because work benefited you, but because being unemployed was itself dangerous. Even when work didn't exist, the expectation did. You played your part in the system because stepping out of rhythm meant stepping into punishment. You learned that the courts weren't places of truth. They were places of decision, quick decisions, biased decisions, decisions that treated confessions as gold and doubt as irrelevance. You prayed never to see the inside of a courtroom, not because you feared guilt, but because innocence had no special protection. There. You learned to fear torture even if you never faced it. The knowledge that pain could be used legally, openly, was enough to teach anyone the value of compliance. Confession didn't equal truth, and truth didn't equal safety. Pain was the only reliable outcome, and you avoided it by staying predictable, agreeable, invisible. And yet, somehow, people lived full lives within these constraints. They loved, they worked, they raised children and crops and hopes. They shared meals, laughter, stories, and holidays. Humans are experts at building meaning even in restrictive systems. Tudor people didn't spend their days cowering. They spent their days navigating. They knew joy, just within boundaries. They knew freedom, but only in pockets. They knew peace, but only when the law wasn't looking directly at them. Over time, survival under Tudor law didn't feel like survival. It felt like normal life, because it was normal life. You learned the rhythms so deeply that the dangers became background noise, just another part of the world like weather, illness, or harvest cycles. You didn't survive by outsmarting the system. You survived by understanding it intimately, knowing what it feared, what it punished, what it rewarded, and how it shifted. You survived by recognizing that justice was not the point. Order was. And the good news, you made it through. You learned to read the shifting winds of royal whims, the expectations of local officers, and the silent rules of neighbours' judgment. You learned to live quietly, cautiously, intelligently. The bad news? Those instincts never left you. You survived the Tudor legal system, but you survived it by becoming the kind of person who checks the door twice, speaks once, listens always, and treats every law like a trap you haven't sprung yet. Good news, you lived. Bad news, you lived Tudor.